The roar of motorcycle engines shattered the peaceful silence of the small town of Cedar Ridge. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. The sound of the bikes grew louder, echoing off the old brick buildings as a group of bikers, led by a towering figure known as Rick the Beast Lawson, made their entrance. The town, known for its quiet charm and old-world appeal, wasn't used to this kind of disruption. Rick and his gang were notorious for causing trouble wherever they went, loud, aggressive, and quick to pick a fight. They were looking for a place to unwind, but in their world, unwinding often meant wreaking havoc. They rolled past the small local shops, and their eyes immediately zeroed in on the one place in town that stood out, Marie's Diner. Inside the diner, Emma Steele Garcia sat in the far corner booth, sipping on a cup of coffee and reading a book. She wasn't the type to draw attention to herself, but there was something about her that made people look twice. At 48, Emma carried herself with a quiet confidence, something that had been forged through years of hardship and perseverance. Her steel-gray eyes, hardened by her military service, held stories of battles fought and won, both on the battlefield and in life. The bikers, particularly Rick, noticed her immediately. He couldn't help but be intrigued by the woman sitting there, her posture straight, her demeanor calm amidst the chaos surrounding her. His instinct told him she wasn't someone to mess with, but then again, that was exactly what made him want to try. As Rick and his gang stormed into the diner, their loud voices filled the room. The waitress, a young woman named Megan, froze for a moment as the bikers strode up to the counter. She had heard rumors about these men, and she knew better than to anger them. Rick's eyes scanned the diner until they landed on Emma. He sauntered over, a grin on his face. "What's a woman like you doing in a place like this?" he asked, his voice dripping with challenge. Emma didn't flinch. She glanced up, her expression calm but sharp. She had been in situations like this before. She dealt with men like Rick, men who thought they could intimidate her because of her gender or her past. "I'm just here for a quiet cup of coffee," Emma replied, her voice steady and unbothered. Rick chuckled darkly, not expecting the cool response. "You know," he said, leaning in just a little too close, "people like you don't belong here. You're out of your league, sweetheart." The other bikers snickered, egging him on. Emma raised an eyebrow, her gaze never leaving his. She'd seen men like Rick in action before, big, loud, and full of themselves. But what they didn't know about her was something they'd soon find out. "What makes you think I'm out of my league?" Emma asked, her tone now colder, harder. The room fell silent for a moment. The bikers looked at each other, confused. Emma was clearly unbothered, unfazed by their presence. She wasn't the type to back down from a confrontation, but Rick, used to people cowering before him, felt his ego start to swell. "How about a little game?" Rick proposed, clearly thinking he had her cornered. "Let's see if you're as tough as you look. My boys and I were just about to head out for a little fun. What do you say? Come with us, or do we need to teach you some manners?" Emma's eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept her cool. It wasn't about whether she could take on Rick and his gang. She had no doubt that she could handle herself. It was about something deeper, something more personal. "I don't need to prove anything to you," Emma said slowly, her voice unwavering. "But if you want to find out just how wrong you are, stick around. I'm not the one you want to mess with." Rick's smirk faltered for a brief moment. He wasn't sure what he had just walked into, but something about Emma didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, or the way her words hit him like a brick. "You don't know who you're talking to, lady," Rick muttered under his breath, but there was a flicker of doubt in his voice. Emma took a long sip of her coffee, the tension in the air thickening as the bikers waited for her to react. Then, without another word, she stood up and walked towards the exit, her boots clicking against the tile floor. She didn't need to say another thing. She knew exactly how to make her point. As she reached the door, she paused and turned back to face Rick, her cold, gray eyes locking with his. "You may think you can bully anyone you meet, but I'm not the one. You'll learn that soon enough." And with that, she stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving the bikers standing there, uncertain of what just happened. Rick stared after her, a knot of unease twisting in his gut. He didn't know who she was, but he had a feeling that messing with Emma Steele Garcia would be his biggest mistake. The small town of Cedar Ridge wasn't used to having outsiders stir up trouble. It was a place where everyone knew each other, and people kept to their own. For Emma, it was the perfect kind of place to settle into after years of chaos and bloodshed. She came here not to escape, but to find peace. But peace had always been elusive for Emma. Born and raised in a rough neighborhood on the outskirts of a large city, Emma had learned from an early age that life wasn't easy. She wasn't the type to sit back and wait for things to happen. She was a fighter, physically and mentally. It was during high school that she discovered the military, and from the moment she enlisted, she found her calling. The discipline, the camaraderie, and the sense of purpose spoke to something deep within her. As a woman in the armed forces, she faced challenges that most men would never understand. She was doubted, overlooked, and underestimated. But she rose through the ranks, proving herself time and again. Her military career was marked by tough missions, long deployments, and a few near-death experiences. But it was the one mission, the mission that ended her career, that would change everything. Emma had been part of a special operations unit sent on a high-risk mission overseas. The mission went south, and they lost half their team. Emma barely escaped with her life. The scars of that operation, both physical and emotional, haunted her for years. She couldn't bear the thought of continuing in the military after that. The ghosts of her fallen comrades weighed heavily on her heart. She left the military and, in an attempt to rebuild her life, moved to Cedar Ridge. It was a quiet town where no one knew her past. She found solace in routine, working at the local auto shop, keeping to herself, and distancing herself from the life she once knew. But deep down, Emma knew she couldn't escape who she was or what she had been. The training, the strength, the sharpness, it was all still there. And every now and then, it would surface, as it had tonight. The next few days passed with a tense quiet in Cedar Ridge. Emma had left the diner that evening, confident that the bikers wouldn't dare follow through with their threats. But she was wrong. Rick, the beast, Lawson wasn't the type to let something go, especially not after a blow to his ego. Word spread quickly around town. The bikers had been humiliated by the woman they tried to intimidate, and that never sat well with a group of men like Rick's. He had been itching for a confrontation ever since Emma walked out of the diner that night, and he wasn't going to back down now. Rick and his gang pulled into Cedar Ridge the following afternoon. This time, there was no attempt at subtlety. Their bikes rumbled down the main street, making sure every resident of the town could hear them. They were out for one thing: revenge. Emma was at the auto shop, finishing up some repairs on a classic truck that had been left in for service. She heard the bikes long before she saw them, the low hum of their engines making her tense. Her instincts kicked in, and she knew they were back. As she wiped the grease from her hands, she took a deep breath and prepared herself. She didn't have to seek them out. They'd come to her. It didn't take long for Rick to find her. He swaggered into the auto shop, his gang following closely behind. The bell above the door jingled, and Emma looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "You didn't think we were going to let you off that easy, did you?" Rick's voice was dripping with challenge. Emma stood up from the workbench, wiping her hands on a rag. She was taller than most women, and her posture, always erect, always strong, made her seem even more formidable. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes flickered with a warning. "I don't want any trouble, Rick," she said evenly, her tone as cold as the steel she'd earned her nickname from. "But if you're looking for it, I won't back down." The bikers behind Rick laughed, but Rick didn't seem to be in the mood for jokes. He didn't respond to her warning. Instead, he leaned in close, invading her personal space in a show of dominance. "You embarrassed me, and now you're going to pay for that." Emma didn't flinch. She wasn't scared of him. No, not at all. What she was dealing with here was far more complicated than just another thug trying to flex his muscles. But she wasn't about to let him think she was some easy target either. "I've already told you. I'm not the one you want to mess with." Emma's voice had dropped to a growl now, low and firm. Rick's face twisted into a smirk. He loved a good fight, especially one he thought he'd win. "Let's see if you feel the same way after this." Before Emma could even react, Rick grabbed a wrench off the workbench and tossed it toward one of his men. "We'll race you," he said, his grin widening. You think you're all tough? Let's see how fast you really are. Emma's eyes locked onto the wrench as it spun through the air and landed neatly in one of the biker's hands. She knew immediately what he meant. He was challenging her to a race on her terms, but one that would humiliate her if she lost. The bikers weren't interested in playing fair. They wanted to show Emma that she wasn't as untouchable as she thought, and they were going to use everything they had to make sure she learned her lesson. She didn't need to think about it long. This wasn't the kind of situation where you back down. If she refused, they'd continue their harassment, and worse, they might start messing with the town itself. The last thing Emma wanted was to drag the good people of Cedar Ridge into her problems, but she knew she couldn't let these bikers have the upper hand. Emma crossed her arms, studying the gang for a moment. All right, she said, her tone still calm but carrying an undeniable weight. I'll race you. The bikers exchanged looks, surprised by her willingness. They had expected her to shy away, to be scared. But Emma had never been one to run. Rick leaned in, giving her one last, sneering look. You're making a big mistake, lady. This is gonna be fun. Later that afternoon, the entire town seemed to be buzzing with excitement. News of the race had spread like wildfire, and the crowd began to gather in front of the local bar and grill, where Rick and his gang had set up their bikes, ready to race. Emma stood off to the side, wearing a pair of old, well-worn boots and jeans. Her jacket was simple, but the look in her eyes was anything but. She had no need to impress anyone. She wasn't racing for show. She was racing because she had no choice. Rick and his gang were revving their engines, trying to outdo one another with loud bursts of noise, showing off their bikes and their bravado. Emma, on the other hand, stayed quiet. She wasn't there to make a spectacle. She was there to win. Her nerves were steady, her heart calm. This wasn't her first race. In fact, it wasn't even the first time she had raced for her life. The years in the military had taught her how to handle stress, to keep her mind clear when others would be rattled. She was going to need every ounce of that focus. Rick stood by his bike, throwing Emma one last taunt. You sure you can handle this, Steele? You might want to just let us have this one. I'd hate to see you get hurt. Emma didn't respond. Instead, she mounted her bike, her movements precise and practiced. The roar of the engines, the excitement in the air. It all faded into the background. She was focused. She was ready. The countdown began, and the bikers revved their engines once more, clearly eager to take the lead. But Emma didn't rush. Her experience told her that patience and precision would win the day. As the signal was given, she shifted into gear with effortless grace. The race was on. The sound of the engines revving filled the cool evening air as Emma sat atop her bike, her grip firm on the handlebars. The crowd had gathered, a mix of locals and curious onlookers, their eyes glued to the street that stretched out ahead. The tension in the air was palpable. This wasn't just a race. It was a battle for pride, for respect, and for Emma's place in this small town. Rick, the beast, Lawson stood beside his bike. His gang huddled around him, smirking and laughing. They were all eager to see Emma eat their dust. To them, this was a simple test, a way to put her in her place. Rick had no idea who he was dealing with, but he was about to find out. Emma took a deep breath, blocking out the noise around her. She knew what this race meant, not just for herself, but for Cedar Ridge. If she let Rick and his gang win, they'd see it as a victory over the town. But if she won, well, that would send a message they wouldn't forget. The crowd's quiet murmurs and eager chatter faded as her mind sharpened, focusing solely on the track ahead. Ready to lose? Rick called over to her, his voice full of bravado. Emma didn't even glance at him. She simply nodded to Megan, the waitress from the diner, who had volunteered to act as the starting official. Megan raised her arm, and the crowd fell into a heavy silence. With a quick glance between the two racers, Megan dropped her hand. Go, she shouted. In an instant, the engines roared to life, and the bikes surged forward, their tires gripping the asphalt as the race began. The sound of engines screaming in the night echoed through Cedar Ridge as the bikers sped down the narrow street. The first stretch was straight and wide, perfect for opening up the throttle. Rick shot ahead, his massive engine roaring louder than Emma's, his bike built for speed and power. But Emma wasn't intimidated. She had ridden bikes like his before, heavier, faster, and more imposing. What he didn't have was the control and finesse that she had honed over the years. Emma's bike may not have been the fastest, but it was nimble. She knew how to navigate tight turns, how to take a corner without losing speed, and how to push her limits when the time came. As they reached the first bend in the road, Emma felt the bike lean into the curve, her body following instinctively. She knew she had to stay close to Rick. He was the bigger target, the one she needed to keep in her sights. But at the same time, she couldn't let herself get too distracted by his size and speed. It was the details that would win her this race. Rick glanced over his shoulder, noticing Emma gaining ground on him. He gritted his teeth and revved the engine harder, trying to pull away. But Emma wasn't done yet. She shot past him on the inside of the turn, barely missing the edge of the road. Her heart raced as she hit the straightaway, her eyes locked ahead. Rick's anger flared, and he pushed his bike even harder, trying to force her back. But Emma had anticipated his next move. She weaved through the road, expertly avoiding obstacles and taking sharp turns, each move executed with precision and control. The crowd cheered as they tore down the final stretch of the course. Emma had pulled ahead, her bike humming beneath her as she pushed it to its limits. Rick, red-faced and desperate to catch up, tried to overtake her on the final curve. But Emma was faster. She leaned into the turn just a fraction harder, and before Rick knew it, she was several feet ahead of him, her speed carrying her past the finish line. The crowd erupted into applause as Emma crossed the line, the roar of her bike still echoing through the night. She skidded to a stop and dismounted, her face still as calm as ever, though inside, her heart was pounding with adrenaline. She had won, not just the race, but the respect she needed to make her point. Rick came in a close second, his bike roaring as he slammed on the brakes. His gang was silent now, the atmosphere thick with surprise. Rick's usual confidence had faltered, and for the first time, he wasn't sure how to respond. His eyes flicked over to Emma, who stood tall, waiting for him to approach. "You think this changes anything?" Rick grumbled as he got off his bike, clearly frustrated. Emma walked over to him slowly, her boots crunching the gravel beneath her feet. She didn't answer him right away, just stood there for a moment, letting the silence hang heavy. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not about changing anything, Rick. It's about understanding that I'm not someone you can push around. And neither is this town." Rick's face twisted into something between anger and grudging respect. He didn't say anything more. He knew she was right. He had tried to humiliate her, to prove he was the dominant one, but she had shown him otherwise. Not through brute force, but through skill, patience, and something he didn't have, control. The other bikers, sensing the shift, began to slowly disperse. The tension that had filled the air was now replaced by an uneasy quiet. Even they knew it was over. They had lost to her, and they didn't know how to handle it. Emma turned away from Rick and his gang, her eyes scanning the small crowd that had gathered. The townspeople were watching, and Emma could feel their eyes on her. Some in awe, others in newfound respect. She had just proven that she wasn't to be underestimated. But there was no time for celebration. Emma had made her point. But this wasn't the end of the story. The bikers might have been forced to back down now, but there was always the possibility they'd come back, seeking revenge for their bruised egos. Emma knew she wasn't out of the woods yet. She walked back toward her bike, her eyes on the horizon. The challenge wasn't over. The real fight, whatever it was that had brought the bikers to Cedar Ridge in the first place, was just beginning. The celebration in Cedar Ridge didn't last long. Word had quickly spread through the town about Emma's victory, and many were eager to congratulate her. They cheered for her bravery, her skill, and the message she'd sent to Rick and his gang. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something more dangerous was lurking beneath the surface. The bikers may have backed down for now, but she knew better than to think they were finished. She spent the night at the local bar, sitting in the corner booth with Megan, the waitress, who had been by her side through the entire ordeal. They weren't exactly celebrating. The air was thick with unease, the noise of the bar drowned out by Emma's thoughts. "Rick won't give up that easily, you know," Megan said, her voice low. "I've seen guys like him before. They don't take losing well." Emma stared into her glass, swirling the ice around. I know. I've dealt with men like him before, but I'm not afraid of him. I won't let him intimidate me. Megan nodded, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. I hope you're right. This whole town's behind you, but you've got to be careful. I've seen too many people mess with the wrong guy and end up paying for it. Emma forced a smile, trying to push away the anxiety creeping in. She wasn't used to letting fear control her, and she wasn't about to start now. But as the evening wore on, that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't until she left the bar and made her way back to her motorcycle shop that things began to take a darker turn. The street was quiet, the soft hum of the town's nightlife echoing in the distance. Emma's boots clicked against the pavement, and the sound of her footsteps seemed louder than usual. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like someone or something was waiting for her in the shadows. She paused, scanning the street, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. She kept walking, brushing off the uneasy feeling, when a car screeched to a halt nearby. The sudden noise made her jump, and she turned to see a black SUV pull up alongside her. The windows were tinted too dark to see who was inside, but she didn't need to guess. The door opened, and two men stepped out, both wearing the leather patches of Rick's gang. Emma's heart skipped a beat. These weren't bikers. These were the enforcers. The muscle. What do you want? She asked, her voice steady despite the rising tension in her chest. One of the men smiled, a cruel, almost predatory grin. Rick wants to talk to you. Now. Emma didn't hesitate. She had expected something like this. They weren't going to let her just walk away. But she wasn't about to go quietly either. Her fingers instinctively reached for the knife she kept tucked at her waist. I'm not going anywhere with you, she said firmly. The second man laughed, shaking his head. You think you have a choice? Rick didn't like being embarrassed. And now he wants to show you what happens when you cross him. Before Emma could react, the first man lunged toward her. She had no time to think. She grabbed the knife from her waist and slashed out, catching the man's wrist as he tried to grab her. He yelped in pain, pulling back, but the second man advanced quickly, trying to circle around her. Emma's pulse raced. She needed to think fast. She wasn't going to win a fight with these two, not out in the open like this. Her mind raced as she scanned her surroundings. There was a narrow alley to her left that led behind the buildings. She could make it there and maybe get a chance to escape, but she had to act now. With a swift movement, Emma kicked the second man's knee, causing him to stumble. She took the opportunity to dart toward the alley, using the momentum of the kick to push herself forward. Her boots hit the ground hard as she sprinted, her breath quickening. The two men shouted after her, but she didn't stop. She heard footsteps pounding behind her, but she didn't dare look back. Every instinct told her to run, to get as far away from them as possible. She needed to get to safety, and the alley would give her the cover she needed. As she turned the corner, she skidded to a stop, coming face to face with a third man. This one was bigger, taller, with the same cold look in his eyes. He didn't move at first, watching her with calculating eyes. You think you can just run away from us? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. There was no escape now. I don't want to fight, she said, her voice strained but determined. But I'm not going to let you hurt me either. The man stepped closer, and in that moment, everything seemed to slow down. She could hear the sound of her heartbeat thumping in her ears. Her mind raced through every move she'd ever learned, every skill she'd honed over the years. The years in the military had taught her how to survive situations like this, but this was different. She wasn't in control of the situation anymore. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small can of pepper spray. The man lunged at her, but she was ready. With a swift motion, she sprayed the can directly into his face. He recoiled, howling in pain as the spray hit his eyes. The second man from earlier appeared in the alley, his face contorted in rage. You little... Emma didn't wait for him to finish. She took off again, sprinting toward the back of the auto shop. The front door was locked, but there was a side entrance she could use. She reached it just as the sound of the men's footsteps began to fade. They weren't far behind, but she could make it. She slammed her palm against the door, forcing it open and slipping inside just as the first man reached the corner. She locked the door behind her, breathing heavily. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, but now, the real danger had only just begun. The bikers weren't just angry anymore. They were out for blood. Emma had made a serious enemy tonight, and she knew it wasn't over. The sound of her heart pounding echoed in Emma's ears as she locked the door behind her. The adrenaline still rushed through her veins, but it was slowly starting to fade into a cold, gnawing dread. She pressed her back against the door, taking deep breaths as she tried to steady herself. She had barely escaped the men in the alley, but they hadn't given up. She could still hear their muffled voices, distant but persistent, as they circled the block outside. Emma couldn't keep running. She knew that much. This fight was no longer about a race. This wasn't about sending a message to Rick. It was about survival. And survival meant more than just being fast on a bike or quick with a knife. It meant knowing when to stand her ground and when to make the tough choices. She took a moment to gather herself before walking deeper into her shop. The dim lights from the overhead fixtures flickered on as she moved through the familiar aisles of tools and bike parts. It should have been a comforting sight, a place where she had built everything she had. But tonight, it felt like a cage. Emma wasn't alone in this town, but the people she cared about were now at risk. Megan, the waitress from the bar, had been a constant support. She had her back, and Emma knew she could count on her. But Megan wasn't a fighter. No one in Cedar Ridge was. This wasn't the kind of fight the town was prepared for. Emma realized, perhaps for the first time, that the stakes had become much larger than she had imagined. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Luke, the mechanic who worked with her. "You okay? I heard about the trouble with Rick's gang. Be careful, Emma. They're not going to stop until they get you." Her fingers hovered over the screen. She wanted to respond, to assure him she was fine. But the truth was, she wasn't. She wasn't fine. She was angry. She was scared. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to do. She typed back quickly, "I'm fine. Just need some time to think." It wasn't a lie. She did need time to think, but not just about herself. It was about Cedar Ridge, about the town she had come to love, about the people she'd promised to protect, even if they didn't know it yet. Emma moved over to the workbench in the back corner of the shop. There, under a pile of grease-stained rags, was her old military gear. The tactical vest, the lightweight body armor, and the weapons she had packed away after her service had ended. She hadn't thought about these things in years, hadn't needed to. The quiet life she had built here had seemed like a far cry from the violent world she had left behind. But tonight, everything had changed. She had survived by relying on her skills in the past. She had survived because she knew how to fight, how to think strategically, and how to stay one step ahead. She would need all of that again. She picked up the vest and strapped it on, adjusting the straps to fit tightly against her torso. Then, she went over to the gun safe in the back of the shop. Her fingers brushed over the cold steel as she opened the door. Inside, nestled between several tools, were a few weapons, a handgun, a knife, and a short-barreled shotgun. She had never intended to use them here, not in Cedar Ridge. But now, it was clear she had no choice. With the shotgun in hand, Emma turned her attention back to her phone. She had to warn the others. If Rick and his gang were going to escalate things, she needed to be ready. Cedar Ridge was her home now, and no one would take it from her. She dialed Megan's number, her fingers shaking slightly as she held the phone to her ear. The line rang once, twice, and then Megan's familiar voice came through. "Hey, Emma. You good?" "I'm fine," Emma said, her voice steady. "But it's getting serious. Rick's gang is gunning for me. I need you to keep an eye on things around the town. If you see anything suspicious, tell me immediately. And don't talk to them if they come by. Don't even acknowledge them. I'm serious." There was a pause, followed by a nervous laugh from Megan. "You think I'd be that stupid? Don't worry, I got your back. Just be careful, okay?" "I will." And Megan, "Thanks." Emma ended the call and sat down on the bench, taking a deep breath. It wasn't just about Rick and his gang anymore. This was about her taking back control of her life. The next few hours were a blur. Emma spent the rest of the night preparing, sharpening her instincts, and making sure her shop was secured. She had no idea what Rick would do next or when he would strike again. But she knew one thing. He was going to regret ever underestimating her. As the morning light began to break, Emma stood outside her shop, looking out over Cedar Ridge. The quiet of the town felt different now. It wasn't peaceful anymore. There was a tension in the air, a sense of impending danger. But Emma wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Her mind raced through 100 different scenarios, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let Rick or anyone else tear this town apart. She would fight back. She would make them understand that messing with a woman like her came with consequences. As she adjusted the strap on her vest and mounted her bike, the weight of what she was about to do settled on her shoulders. This wasn't just a fight for her. It was a fight for everyone who had called Cedar Ridge home. And this time, there would be no running. The sun was low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the sleepy town of Cedar Ridge. For a brief moment, everything seemed peaceful again. The streets were empty, save for a few locals walking to their cars or sipping coffee outside the diner. The hum of the world turning back to normal after the storm was almost comforting. Almost. Emma stood at the edge of the parking lot, her bike parked beside her, the leather of her vest creaking as she shifted her weight. She had made her decision. The silence of the morning gave her no comfort. If anything, it was a reminder that she was running out of time. She had prepared for the worst, but the hardest part now was waiting. Waiting for Rick to make his next move. In the quiet, her thoughts wandered back to the night before. She couldn't shake the image of the men who had cornered her in the alley. Their cruel grins, the way they had closed in, had all but confirmed her worst fears. Rick's gang wasn't just a bunch of bikers. They were ruthless, willing to do anything to reclaim what they thought was theirs. And she was their target. But there was something else she hadn't shared with Megan, or even with herself. This was personal. Rick didn't just want to scare her off. He wanted to break her. He tried once before. He would try again. The gang wasn't his only weapon. His twisted pride was what made him dangerous. Emma turned toward the shop, her hand brushing over the side of her bike, grounding herself in the motion. Her breath was slow, steady. She needed clarity before she took action. The storm was coming, and when it did, there would be no turning back. Just as she turned to head back inside, her phone buzzed in her pocket. The familiar text notification flashed on the screen. Heads up. I've spotted something strange by the docks. Thought you should know. It was from Luke. Her heart skipped. The docks weren't a place she usually associated with Rick's crew, but anything was possible. She quickly typed a reply, "Stay put. I'm on my way." Her mind raced as she revved the engine of her bike. Luke's message had been enough to snap her back into action. She had to see it for herself. She couldn't afford to wait for Rick's next move. She had to make it first. The ride to the docks wasn't long, but the sense of unease that had been building inside her was impossible to shake. The streets of Cedar Ridge, quiet as they were, seemed to echo with the weight of what was coming. She was no longer just a mechanic. She was no longer just a veteran. She was someone standing between her home and the chaos Rick and his gang were ready to bring. And she wasn't about to let them win. The docks appeared ahead, the old wooden piers reaching out into the water like skeletal fingers. In the distance, she could make out the faint outline of Luke's truck, parked near a rusted warehouse. But it wasn't the truck that caught her attention. It was the figure standing beside it. Tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakable. Rick. Emma's grip on the handlebars tightened. This was it. The confrontation she had been waiting for was finally here. She couldn't afford to hesitate, but she also couldn't rush in blindly. She had to be smart about this. She slowed her bike as she approached the area, keeping to the shadows where possible. As she drew closer, she saw Luke talking to Rick, his posture tense but his voice steady. He was trying to hold the line, but Rick wasn't one to listen to reason. Rick saw her before Luke did. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto hers, and a twisted smile spread across his face. Well, Rick's voice rang out across the docks. Look who finally decided to show up. Emma didn't flinch. She stopped her bike just out of range, staying seated, waiting for the right moment. She knew this moment would define everything. "You're not welcome here, Rick," Emma said, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of everything she had been holding in for days. "And I'm not leaving until you get your gang and your bullshit out of Cedar Ridge. This is my town now." Rick chuckled, a low, menacing sound that seemed to reverberate across the empty pier. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning her, sizing her up like a predator. "You think you can just take over?" he sneered. "This town's mine. It always has been. You lost this town the moment you thought you could push me around," Emma shot back, standing tall despite the tension that clung to the air. "You're outnumbered here, and if you're smart, you'll leave before things get ugly." Rick took a step forward, his hands raised in mock surrender. "I don't know, Emma. You've got some guts, but you're not going to win this. Not when you're all alone." Emma's gaze never wavered. She knew what he was trying to do, trying to get under her skin, trying to provoke her into making a mistake. But she wasn't the same person she had been when she first arrived in Cedar Ridge. This time, she was ready for him. She didn't respond. Instead, she reached into the bag strapped to her bike and pulled out a flare gun. One of the few things left from her military days that might actually make a difference. She leveled it at the sky, her finger poised on the trigger. Rick's face darkened when he saw it. "You wouldn't." "Try me," Emma said, her voice cold and unwavering. The standoff seemed to stretch for eternity, the sound of the wind in the distance and the lapping of water against the dock the only noise between them. Rick studied her for a moment longer, his eyes flickering between the flare gun and Emma's determined expression. Then, with a grunt of frustration, he backed away. "Don't think you've won, Emma," he muttered, as he turned and motioned for Luke to step aside. "This isn't over. You just made a bigger mistake than you realize." And with that, he stalked off, disappearing into the shadows with his gang trailing behind him. The docks were eerily quiet once again. Emma let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her fingers still tight around the flare gun. She didn't let her guard down. Not yet. She knew that this was only a temporary retreat, but it was a victory, however small. And sometimes, that was all you needed to get one step closer to winning the war. Luke walked over, his expression relieved but still cautious. "That was bold," he said with a half-smile. "But did you really have to pull out the flare gun?" Emma smirked, finally lowering the weapon. "Sometimes, you just have to remind people you're not afraid to light things up." The weight of the situation wasn't lost on her, but for the first time in days, Emma allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. Rick and his gang had been put on notice. Cedar Ridge wasn't theirs for the taking. The night after her confrontation with Rick was restless. Emma couldn't shake the weight of the standoff at the docks. Though she had stood her ground, the unease was still there, lingering in the shadows of her mind. She hadn't won yet. Not by a long shot. The flare gun had been a message, but Rick was a man who didn't take defeat lightly. And when a man like that swore revenge, it wasn't over until it was. She knew he'd be back, and she knew it would be worse than before. The morning sun broke over Cedar Ridge in its usual quiet way, but Emma felt anything but peaceful. The small town seemed to be holding its breath, as if it too understood the storm was coming. The calm before the storm. As she walked into the shop, the soft chime of the bell over the door rang, a familiar sound that used to make her feel at home. Today, it felt like an omen. She moved mechanically, eyes scanning every corner of the room. She was waiting for the first sign of danger, waiting for Rick's gang to make their move. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She reached for it, her hand trembling slightly as she saw Megan's name flash on the screen. "Emma, they're here. Rick's men are at the diner. They're causing trouble. Please hurry." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Rick wasn't just making a statement anymore. He was testing her. He was forcing her to act, to show him just how far she was willing to go. Without thinking, Emma grabbed her jacket, the leather cool against her skin. She threw her helmet on, ready to face whatever Rick's gang had in store. The adrenaline surged through her veins, pushing away the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. This wasn't just about protecting Cedar Ridge anymore. This was personal. Rick had gone after the one thing that mattered most to her, her community. And Emma wasn't going to stand by and watch it fall apart. The engine roared to life as Emma revved the bike, speeding out of the parking lot and down the main street toward the diner. The wind whipped at her face, a harsh reminder that she was no longer just the mechanic, the quiet woman trying to live a peaceful life. She was a force to be reckoned with. When she arrived at the diner, The scene was chaos. Rick's men had gathered outside, loud and threatening, shouting at the few patrons who had been brave enough to stay for breakfast. Megan was standing just inside the door, her face pale but determined, keeping an eye on the crowd. Emma parked her bike and stepped off it, every muscle in her body tense with anticipation. She took a deep breath, then pushed open the door to the diner. The noise stopped instantly, as if the entire town had been holding its breath along with her. The handful of people inside turned to look at her, some of them hopeful, others unsure. Rick's gang sneered at her, but Emma's gaze was fixed firmly on Rick himself, who was standing near the counter, arms crossed and a smug look on his face. "So, the little mechanic thinks she can stand up to me," Rick said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'll give you credit, Emma. You've got guts. But that doesn't change a thing. This town is mine. You don't belong here." Emma's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't back down. This wasn't the time for words. She didn't need to convince him. She needed to make him understand. "I don't need your approval, Rick," Emma said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm not leaving Cedar Ridge, and neither is anyone else." Rick laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think you're the hero of this little town? You're just a pawn, and I'll break you, just like I've broken everyone else who stood in my way." The silence in the diner was thick with the promise of violence. Emma could see the anger in Rick's eyes, the desperation. This wasn't just about taking over Cedar Ridge anymore. This was about his pride, his need to prove that he was untouchable. Emma's hand slipped into her jacket pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold steel of the handgun she kept for emergencies. She didn't want to use it, but she would if it came down to it. Rick stepped closer, his men following his lead. The tension in the room was palpable. Emma could feel the eyes of everyone in the diner on her, waiting for her to make the next move. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first came to Cedar Ridge. She had learned what it meant to stand strong, to fight for what mattered. Rick was within arm's reach now, and Emma made her move. In a blur of motion, she reached out and grabbed Rick's wrist, twisting it with a force that surprised even her. He yelped in pain, but before he could react, she kicked the back of his knee, sending him crashing to the floor. The men who had been standing by watched in stunned silence, too surprised to make a move. Emma stood over him, breathing heavily, adrenaline flooding her system. She wasn't going to kill him, but she was going to make sure he knew his place. "You've had your fun, Rick," she said, her voice cold as ice. "But if you ever threaten this town again, I won't hesitate. You've already made a mess of things, but I'm the one cleaning it up." Rick glared at her, pain in his eyes, but there was a flicker of fear too. He knew he had underestimated her. He hadn't expected this from her. The silence stretched for a long moment before Rick growled, pushing himself to his feet, his face twisted with anger and humiliation. "This isn't over, Emma. You'll regret this." "I doubt it," she said, her voice steady. She stepped back, her eyes never leaving him. "Now get out of my town." With that, Rick and his men backed off, muttering angrily under their breath. They knew better than to challenge her in front of the whole diner. They knew it wasn't worth it. When they left, the room exhaled in relief, the tension melting away like the first rays of dawn after a storm. Megan came over, her eyes wide with admiration. "You really did it, Emma. You really did it." Emma smiled, though it was a thin, tight-lipped one. "I told you I would." For a moment, she let herself believe it was over. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Rick wouldn't give up that easily. But today, she had one. And for the first time in a long time, Emma felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. The adrenaline of the previous day's confrontation still pulsed in Emma's veins. But as the hours passed, it began to settle into a steady, gnawing discomfort. She'd put Rick and his men in their place, at least for now. But she knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. It couldn't be. Rick was the type of man who didn't take humiliation lightly, and it was only a matter of time before he came back with a vengeance. As Emma closed the shop for the night, the sun sinking low in the sky, she took a moment to steady her breathing. Her hands were still trembling from the fight earlier, but it wasn't fear she felt. It was a quiet understanding of what needed to happen next. She couldn't wait for Rick to make the first move. This time, she was going to go to him. The thought of confronting Rick on his turf sent a chill down her spine. But that was the nature of the beast. Rick didn't respect her because she stayed in the shadows. He only respected power, and Emma had learned over the years that sometimes you had to go straight for the heart of the storm if you wanted to survive it. As she locked up, a car pulled into the parking lot. It was Luke. He stepped out of his truck, looking uncharacteristically serious. "Hey, Emma, can we talk?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. She nodded, motioning for him to follow her into the shop. Once the door was closed behind them, she leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "What's up, Luke?" she asked, her voice quiet but tinged with the edge of wariness she couldn't shake. She'd been expecting him, but not like this. Luke hesitated, taking a moment to gather his thoughts before he spoke. "I don't want to add to your plate, but there's something I've been hearing around town, and I think you need to know about it." Emma raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Luke looked over his shoulder, almost as if to check if anyone was listening. "There's talk about Rick and his gang, about some bigger plans. I think they're gearing up for something more serious than just a little intimidation." Emma's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Luke's voice lowered. "I overheard a conversation. They're talking about running guns through Cedar Ridge. Word is, they've got connections in the city, and they're using this town as a way station for something bigger. Drugs, weapons, who knows? But they're moving stuff through here." The revelation hit Emma like a slap in the face. It was one thing for Rick to want control over Cedar Ridge. It was another to turn it into a haven for illegal activity. This was no longer just about pride or power. It was about profits, about dangerous people flooding into her town and bringing violence with them. "You're sure about this?" Emma asked, her voice sharp. Luke nodded. "I wouldn't be bringing it up if I wasn't. But I think they're keeping things quiet for now, at least until they've got everything in place." Emma's mind raced. She needed to act fast. Rick had already shown he wasn't afraid to push people around. Now, he was bringing something far more dangerous into the equation. She had to figure out where the guns were being stored and stop it before the town became a battleground. "I'll take care of it," Emma said, her resolve hardening. "But we need more information. I can't just storm in there and hope for the best." Luke was silent for a moment, considering her words. Then he nodded. "There's a warehouse out by the old railroad tracks. It's remote, doesn't get a lot of foot traffic. It's where I think they've been storing things." Emma's heart hammered in her chest. A warehouse. She could work with that. "I'll check it out." Luke placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze softening. "Be careful. You don't know what kind of people you're dealing with." Emma met his eyes, her expression steady. "I'm used to dealing with the worst." With that, Luke left, and Emma was alone again. But her mind was far from quiet. The warehouse, the guns, the drugs, all of it was part of a much larger picture, one that Rick was orchestrating, and one that Emma was determined to stop before it consumed everything. The hours ticked by slowly as night fell over Cedar Ridge. Emma prepared herself for what lay ahead, gathering supplies and mentally rehearsing the plan. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't sit back and let Rick destroy her town, no matter how much he thought he could control it. Around midnight, Emma suited up. Her gear was minimal, just enough to get the job done. She didn't need any extra attention, and she certainly didn't need any more unnecessary drama. She threw on her leather jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and pulled on a pair of boots that had seen more than their fair share of tough situations. The ride to the warehouse felt like it took forever. The streets of Cedar Ridge were eerily quiet at this hour, the usual sounds of life replaced by the hum of the bike's engine. Every twist and turn felt calculated, as if the town was holding its breath for the inevitable showdown. When she arrived at the warehouse, her stomach churned. The place was exactly what she had expected. Old, abandoned, with rusted metal and broken windows that spoke of years of neglect. But Emma wasn't here for a history lesson. She was here to find answers. She dismounted her bike and crept toward the entrance, keeping low and moving with the shadows. The air smelled of oil and dust, the scent sharp and heavy. Her heart was thumping in her chest, each beat reminding her of the risks she was about to take. The warehouse door was locked, but not for long. Emma's experience as a mechanic came in handy as she popped the lock with ease, slipping inside without making a sound. She could feel the tension in her muscles as she moved, her senses heightened. Something was off. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, even if she couldn't see them. Inside, the warehouse was massive, dark, and cold. The only light came from the slivers of moonlight breaking through the cracks in the walls. But as her flashlight swept across the room, she froze. In the far corner, hidden behind some old crates, she could make out several large wooden crates stacked high. Her heart skipped a beat. This was it. She moved closer, carefully and silently, until she was standing right next to the crates. She didn't need to open them to know what was inside. She could hear the unmistakable sound of metal shifting and the cold, sickly feel of reality sinking in. Rick was more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And now, Emma knew exactly what she was up against. Emma knew there was no turning back now. The crates, filled with weapons and contraband, had confirmed everything she feared. Rick wasn't just a thug trying to take over Cedar Ridge. He was part of a far larger network, one that was using her quiet town as a key waypoint for illegal activities. And now, she had to find a way to shut it all down before it spread any further. But as she stood in the dimly lit warehouse, her mind raced with how to handle it. She couldn't take this on alone. The stakes were too high, and the danger too real. The warehouse wasn't just a stash house. It was the center of a much larger operation that was already affecting everyone in Cedar Ridge. If she was going to expose it, she needed help. But she also knew that she couldn't trust everyone in town. Her first thought was Luke. He was a loyal friend, a good man, but she could sense his hesitation. He'd been in trouble before, and even though he had warned her about the weapons deal, she didn't know if he was ready to go this far. But there was another person in town who had experience with dangerous people, and that was the one person Emma had hoped she wouldn't have to rely on, Megan. Megan had spent years dealing with shady characters from her past. She had been a law enforcement officer before returning to Cedar Ridge, and although she had left that life behind, her connections, knowledge, and skills were invaluable. It was time to swallow her pride. Emma needed Megan. She dialed Megan's number, her heart pounding. The phone rang for a moment before Megan's voice came on the line. "Emma? What's going on?" "I need your help," Emma said, her voice steady but urgent. "I found Rick's warehouse. It's full of weapons and who knows what else. I can't do this alone." Megan didn't hesitate. "I knew something wasn't right. I've been digging into Rick's connections for a while now. I'll meet you at the shop in 20 minutes. The weight of the decision settled on Emma's shoulders. Megan was her only hope to navigate the dangerous web that Rick had spun. It wasn't just about protecting Cedar Ridge anymore. It was about bringing down an entire operation. And if they were going to succeed, they would need to be smart and strategic. When Megan arrived, the two women didn't waste time. They gathered the necessary tools, radios, flashlights, and a small stash of weapons for protection. Megan had brought a few firearms, and Emma had her own pistol tucked into the waistband of her jeans. They were a team now, but this wasn't a mission they could afford to fail. "We need to get to the warehouse before Rick realizes we figured him out," Megan said, checking her gear one last time. Emma nodded. "I've got a plan. We'll go in quietly, find any intel we can, and get out before they know we're there. I don't want to make it worse than it already is." As they headed out toward the warehouse, the night felt heavier than ever. The air was thick with anticipation, and every sound, the hum of insects, the rustle of the wind, felt like a warning. There were too many unknowns, and Emma knew the path she was about to take would change everything. The drive to the warehouse was long, the streets eerily empty, save for the occasional car that passed by. Emma could feel her heartbeat in her throat, her mind racing through every worst-case scenario. What if they got caught? What if they didn't find anything? What if Rick was waiting for them, ready to ambush them? But as they approached the warehouse, Emma felt a strange calm. This was her fight. This was her town, and she wasn't going to let anyone destroy it. They parked a few blocks away, out of sight, and began the walk to the warehouse under the cover of darkness. Megan led the way, her movements precise and practiced, while Emma kept to the shadows. Every step was calculated, every breath measured. As they neared the building, Emma could see the faint glow of lights in the distance. It wasn't much, just a few low lamps scattered around the perimeter, but it was enough to let them know that someone was inside. The place was alive, and that made Emma even more determined to move quickly. They crouched by the side of the warehouse, near a set of rusted steel doors. Megan gave Emma a brief nod before slipping a lock-picking tool out of her pocket. "Stay quiet," she whispered. "We don't want to make any noise." Emma nodded, her eyes scanning the area for any movement. They waited for Megan to work, her hands deftly maneuvering the lock. It clicked open after a few moments, and the two women slipped inside. The warehouse was as dark and cold as it had been the first time Emma entered, but now the stakes were even higher. The smell of metal and dust filled the air, and the only sound was the creaking of the old building. They moved deeper into the warehouse, careful not to disturb anything that could give them away. Emma's heart raced, and each time they turned a corner, her breath caught in her throat. But nothing happened. They were still in the clear. Then, as they rounded a corner, they came upon a small office in the back of the warehouse. A dim light flickered from within. Emma signaled to Megan to stay low as they crept forward. Through the small window in the office door, Emma could make out the silhouette of a man sitting at a desk. His back was to them, and he was hunched over something, papers scattered in front of him. "Rick's men," Megan whispered, her voice barely audible. Emma motioned for her to stay back. The man at the desk was their first lead. If they could get close enough to him, they might be able to find more information. Information that could help them expose everything Rick was doing. With Megan keeping watch, Emma slowly approached the office door. She reached for the knob and twisted it carefully, slipping inside without making a sound. The man at the desk never saw her coming. Emma was on him in seconds, a firm hand on his shoulder, twisting him around before he could react. "What's going on here?" she demanded in a low, forceful voice. "Where is Rick?" The man froze, eyes wide with fear. I don't know anything," he stammered. Emma narrowed her eyes. "You're going to tell me everything. Now." The man's eyes were wide with fear, his entire body trembling as Emma pressed him against the cold metal of the office desk. The dim light from the overhead lamp cast long shadows across the room, making it feel like they were inside some kind of underground chamber. A stifling silence hung in the air as Emma tightened her grip on his shoulder, her pulse quickening with every passing second. I don't know what you're talking about," he gasped, his voice cracking. "I'm just a guy trying to do my job." Emma leaned in closer, her voice cold and unyielding. "Your job, huh? You're moving weapons and God knows what else through Cedar Ridge, and you expect me to believe you don't know anything?" The man's eyes darted to the door behind Emma, and she knew that he was either trying to gauge his chances of escape or silently hoping someone would come to his rescue. But he wasn't going anywhere. Not if Emma had anything to say about it. Megan, who had been standing guard just outside the office, appeared in the doorway. Her eyes were steely, and she gave Emma a subtle nod, signaling that everything was still quiet on their end. Emma turned back to the man at the desk, her grip loosening just enough to let him know she wasn't playing games anymore. "This is your last chance," Emma said, her voice low and controlled. "Tell me what's going on, and I'll make sure you walk out of here tonight. Keep lying, and things will get a lot worse for you." The man swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. He was clearly caught between fear and desperation, unsure if he should spill the truth or keep his loyalty to Rick, even though it was obvious that loyalty was quickly becoming a dangerous game to play. Finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Rick," he murmured. "He's got connections, okay? Not just in Cedar Ridge. He's working with people from the city, from way down south. They're using the warehouse as a drop-off point. Guns, drugs, money, you name it." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. The realization hit her with the force of a punch. It wasn't just a small-time operation anymore. Rick was part of a larger syndicate, a criminal network far beyond anything Emma had ever imagined. The man continued, his voice shaky. I don't know all the details, but the shipments come in, and we offload them. Rick's not the leader, though. He's just the guy who handles the local stuff, gets everything into the system. But the big fish, they're the ones behind it, the ones who make the decisions. I've never met them. They keep their distance. All I know is that they're dangerous. Real dangerous. Emma exchanged a glance with Megan. The implications of what the man had said were staggering. The operation was larger than just Rick. It was part of something that reached far beyond Cedar Ridge, and it was only a matter of time before it would consume the entire town. Where do the shipments go after they leave here? Megan asked, stepping into the room with a calm authority that contrasted Emma's growing anger. I don't know, the man stammered. They go to different places. Some are moved out of state, others are stored. But that's all I can tell you. Emma could feel the rage building inside her. She had known Rick was bad news, but this was beyond her worst expectations. Not only had he been manipulating Cedar Ridge, but he was now a pawn in a much larger criminal game. The realization hit her hard. The stakes had never been higher. Who's your contact? Emma demanded, her voice sharp. Who do you report to? Who does Rick answer to? The man shook his head vigorously. I don't know. I've never seen them face to face. But I can tell you this. Rick's planning something big. He's been talking about a shipment that's coming in the next couple of days. He's been really nervous about it, acting like everything depends on it. Emma's mind raced. This was the breakthrough they needed. She could feel it in her bones. The shipment was the key to bringing Rick, and the whole operation, down. If she could intercept it, she could stop the network cold. But it was going to be dangerous. The people involved weren't just criminals. They were organized and ruthless. Megan stepped closer, her expression hardening. Where's the shipment going to be dropped off? We need to know. I don't know the exact location, the man admitted. But Rick, he's been meeting someone at the old gas station near the highway. I've seen him leave a couple of times in the past week, always at night. He's been acting weird, like something big's coming. The tension in the room thickened. Emma turned to Megan, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. This was it. The plan had taken shape. Rick's secret meeting was the opportunity they needed to uncover everything. They couldn't wait any longer. We're going to the gas station, Emma said, her voice filled with resolve. We intercept that meeting, we get the intel we need, and we shut this whole operation down. Megan nodded. Let's do it. The gas station sat on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, a relic from a time when the town had been bustling and the highway had been more traveled. Now, it was just a shadow of its former self, abandoned most of the time except for the occasional car that stopped for fuel or a quick snack. But tonight, the station had a different kind of visitor. Emma and Megan approached in silence, keeping their distance. The shadows of the station seemed to swallow them whole as they moved, but Emma's instincts were razor-sharp, and her grip on the flashlight was firm. They could see the flicker of headlights in the distance, slowly drawing closer. It's him, Megan whispered, her voice low but urgent. Emma's heart rate spiked. Rick was coming. But who was he meeting? The car pulled into the parking lot, its engine dying as the driver stepped out. A tall man with a hard face and cold eyes emerged from the vehicle, the kind of man you'd expect to see in a movie about crime syndicates. Emma and Megan exchanged a quick look. This was it, the moment they'd been waiting for. The two women stayed low, barely breathing as they crouched behind an old dumpster, watching the exchange unfold in front of them. Rick stepped up to the man, shaking his hand. It was too far to hear their conversation clearly, but Emma could see the tension in their posture, the nervous energy that crackled between them. Let's go, Emma whispered, rising from her crouch. We're getting too close. But as they moved toward the car, a sharp, sudden noise froze them in their tracks. Footsteps. Someone was approaching from behind. Emma spun around, and there, standing in the shadows, was a figure that made her blood run cold. Did you really think you could just walk in and take everything from me? Rick's voice was low, dangerous, and filled with menace. The air felt thick with tension as Emma and Megan froze, caught off guard by Rick's sudden appearance. The shadows had played tricks on them, and now, standing face to face with him, Emma realized how unprepared they truly were. Rick's eyes were hard, narrowed with cold fury. He wasn't just angry. He was calculating, dangerous. The kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a threat. Emma's hand instinctively reached for the gun at her side, but she kept it steady, not yet drawing it. She needed to think. They couldn't let Rick see how cornered they were. Megan shifted slightly, positioning herself between Emma and the figure standing across from them. Rick smirked. I should have known you two would be the ones to show up here. I thought you were smarter than that, Emma. You're running out of places to hide, Rick, Emma said, her voice calm but firm. You don't control this town anymore. This ends tonight. Rick's grin widened, but there was no humor in it. You think you've won? You've only just scratched the surface. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Before Emma could respond, the sound of car doors slamming and boots crunching against gravel echoed from the road behind them. Rick's back up. Emma felt her stomach drop. They weren't just outnumbered. They were surrounded. Megan's hand shot out, signaling Emma to stay quiet, to think quickly. We need to go now, she whispered urgently. But Emma's mind raced. This wasn't just about getting away anymore. This was about stopping everything. She couldn't let Rick slip through her fingers again, not after all they had uncovered. They needed leverage, and fast. Let's make a deal, Rick, Emma said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart in her chest. I'll let you walk away. You give us everything you've got on this operation. Your contacts, your shipments, the big players, everything. We both know you're going to end up behind bars either way. This is your one shot to save yourself. Rick scoffed, clearly enjoying the power he thought he still had. He stepped closer, his voice low and taunting. And why would I do that? So you can lock me up and feel good about yourself? Or maybe you think you can just take me out, huh? You and your little sidekick? He nodded toward Megan, a sneer forming on his lips. I'm not here for your games, Megan shot back, her voice cold and even. And you're not leaving here without paying for what you've done. For a split second, Rick seemed to hesitate, his eyes flicking toward the men who had now closed in around him. Emma's sharp eyes caught the change. It was a brief moment of doubt. Was Rick actually scared? Suddenly, before Emma could make her move, one of the men with Rick, a tall, bulky figure wearing a leather jacket, pulled out a gun, pointing it straight at her. No more talks, he growled. You're out of your league. Emma's instincts took over. With lightning speed, she drew her pistol and aimed it directly at the man's chest. She didn't pull the trigger. Not yet. But she wasn't going to let him think he had the upper hand. Back off, Emma said through gritted teeth. Her hand was steady as she held the gun in place, ready to fire if needed. I don't want to do this, but I will if I have to. For a tense moment, the two sides were locked in a standoff, the only sound being the distant hum of the highway and the pounding of Emma's heart in her ears. Time seemed to stretch, the decision weighing heavily on her. Rick laughed bitterly. You think this is how it ends? You think you can just walk away from this? You've got no idea who you're messing with. Before Emma could respond, a gunshot rang out, echoing through the night air. But it wasn't her gun. The bulky man staggered backward, his eyes wide with surprise. Blood blossomed from his shoulder, and he dropped his weapon, clutching at the wound. Megan was already in motion, her gun aimed and steady, smoke still rising from the barrel. Take him down, Megan shouted, and without hesitation, Emma did just that. In a swift, fluid movement, Emma's gun was aimed at Rick's chest, and she fired, the loud bang reverberating through the stillness. The shot wasn't meant to kill. It wasn't even meant to wound. But it was enough to get his attention. Rick flinched as the bullet grazed his arm, his smirk faltering as he realized that this wasn't a negotiation anymore. It wasn't a game. You think this will stop anything? Rick spat, his voice barely a whisper now, filled with venom and disbelief. You have no idea who you're up against, Emma. You've lost. Emma stepped closer, her gun still trained on him. Maybe you're right, but not tonight. Tonight, you're going to pay for what you've done to this town. Megan moved to cover their backs, keeping an eye on the men who were still circling, trying to figure out what to do. The situation was spiraling out of control, but Emma didn't back down. She couldn't afford to. Rick made a final desperate move, reaching for his phone in his jacket pocket. Emma was quicker. Before he could dial, she kicked the phone out of his hand and stomped on it, shattering it into pieces beneath her boot. Game over, she said coldly. A moment of silence passed as they all stood there, the weight of the confrontation sinking in. Rick, blood dripping from his arm, looked defeated. The men who had surrounded them now hesitated, unsure of what to do. "Arrest him," Megan ordered, her voice like steel. "Now." Two of the men stepped forward, cautiously, hands raised in surrender. Rick's men weren't prepared for this. They hadn't anticipated a fight, and now they were out of options. One of the men, the same bulky figure who had been shot, limped forward, hands raised. "We give up. Just don't kill us." Emma kept her gun trained on Rick, her jaw clenched with determination. She wasn't going to let up now. "You're all going to jail," she said. "And this town is finally free from your poison." As the sound of sirens approached in the distance, the finality of the moment hit Emma. The battle wasn't over, but this was a major victory. Rick was finally taken down, and his criminal operation was about to crumble. Megan gave Emma a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the dangerous path they had walked. But it wasn't over yet. There were still unanswered questions and more work to do. The bigger fight was just beginning. The flashing red and blue lights of the sirens illuminated the dark parking lot, casting eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. Emma's heart still raced as the distant sounds of law enforcement drawing near filled the air. Rick and his men were cuffed, subdued, and ready to be hauled off to jail, but the weight of the moment settled heavily on Emma's shoulders. The adrenaline was starting to fade, and in its place came the overwhelming realization that this was far from over. Megan stood by her side, her gaze sharp as she scanned their surroundings, making sure there were no other surprises lurking in the dark corners of the gas station lot. "It's done," Megan said, her voice quiet but firm. "Rick's out of the picture. At least for now." Emma nodded, but the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach wouldn't go away. They had brought down the local kingpin, but what about the larger syndicate? What about the network Rick was part of? There was more to this story, and she knew it. The battle might have been won, but the war? That was still looming over them. "Yeah, but there's still a lot we don't know," Emma murmured, looking back at the men who were now being escorted into the back of police cars. Rick, his arm bandaged but still full of defiance, shot her one last venomous look. "This won't be the last we hear of this." Megan's lips pressed into a thin line. "We've taken a significant step, but I agree. We need to be prepared. There's always someone else pulling the strings." As the officers rounded up the rest of Rick's crew, Emma pulled out her phone and sent a quick message to her contact in the FBI. She knew that with Rick in custody, it was time to escalate the investigation, to bring in the bigger guns. The feds had the resources and connections to take down the syndicate that stretched far beyond Cedar Ridge. But that would take time. Time they didn't have. "We should head back to town, regroup," Emma suggested. "We can plan our next move from there." Megan nodded, her face unreadable as she glanced at the men in the back of the police cars. "Yeah, but we've got one more thing to do before we can call it a night." Emma raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Megan pointed to the nearby gas station's office. "We need to make sure the paperwork's all there." Rick's operation wasn't just about shipments. He was laundering money through the business. There's evidence here that could tie everything together. The two of them moved quickly, heading toward the office where they knew Rick had been handling some of his more shady dealings. As they pushed open the door, the smell of stale coffee and old paperwork filled the air. The dim light from a single desk lamp revealed a stack of documents, folders, and files scattered haphazardly across the counter. Emma scanned the room, her eyes landing on a safe in the corner. She had a hunch that the real answers were locked inside. "Megan, you want to do the honors?" Megan grinned, already heading toward the safe. "You know I'm good at this." A few moments later, Megan had the safe open, revealing a trove of documents. Everything from transaction records to names and phone numbers that Emma knew weren't going to lead to anything good. But it was the ledger at the bottom of the pile that caught her attention. She skimmed through it quickly, feeling her pulse quicken as she processed the names and numbers. There were shipments listed, dates, amounts, and names that Emma recognized from the town's underworld. "This is it," Emma said, her voice tight with excitement. "This is the proof we need to take down the whole operation." Megan moved to her side, scanning the ledger. "Looks like Rick wasn't the mastermind. He was just the middleman. We've got names, addresses, everything we need to put a stop to this for good." Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting the moment of triumph. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the name on the screen. It was her contact from the FBI. Emma. The voice on the other end of the line was tense, urgent. We've got a problem. Rick's network? It's bigger than we thought. We've tracked some of the shipments, and they're linked to organized crime families all over the country. We need your help to take them down. Now. Emma's stomach tightened. The truth of it hit her all at once. They weren't just fighting local thugs anymore. They were up against something much larger, a sprawling criminal empire with connections across state lines, maybe even internationally. We've got the paperwork. We've got everything we need, Emma said, her voice steady but filled with determination. We're on it. She ended the call and turned to Megan, her eyes hard with resolve. This is far from over, but we've got what we need to finally put an end to it. Rick's just the beginning. Megan's expression mirrored Emma's. They both knew what this meant. They had the evidence to take down the operation, but the people behind it weren't going to go down without a fight. We're in this together, Megan said, her voice quiet but firm. Emma nodded. Always. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the sleepy town of Cedar Ridge. Emma stood outside the police station, her arms crossed over her chest as she watched the officers file in and out, preparing for the next phase of the operation. The town was still recovering from the shock of what had happened the night before, but Emma knew this was just the beginning. She had made the call to the FBI, and they were already coordinating with local law enforcement to begin the process of dismantling the larger syndicate. They had everything they needed, the names, the paperwork, and the connections. Now, it was time to take action. But as Emma stood there, staring out at the horizon, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come. The calm before the storm. They had taken down the local operation, but the network was vast, and there would be more to fight, more dangers to face. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text from Megan. We're ready. Let's do this. Emma took a deep breath, letting the weight of the past few days settle on her. They had come a long way, but there was still more work to do. And as long as the fight wasn't over, neither was Emma. She was in it for the long haul. With one last glance at the quiet town, Emma turned and headed back into the police station. This was just the beginning of the end. The hum of the helicopter blades echoed in Emma's ears as she watched the sprawling landscape of Cedar Ridge fade away beneath her. The familiar town, once a place of comfort, now felt like a distant memory, like a chapter that had already been closed. There was no time to linger on the past. The road ahead was uncertain, and the danger loomed larger than ever. Emma and Megan had been flown out to the FBI's field office in Denver, the next crucial step in their investigation. What had started as a local crime syndicate had quickly expanded into something far more sinister, with roots deep within multiple states. The connections they had uncovered were only the tip of the iceberg, and now it was up to them to take down the operation once and for all. As the helicopter descended toward the FBI compound, Emma couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting for the safety of every town, every community that had been touched by this organization. The stakes were higher than ever. Once they landed, they were ushered into a secure building where a team of FBI agents and local law enforcement were already assembled, ready to finalize their plan. As Emma and Megan entered the room, the murmurs died down, and all eyes turned toward them. Agent Barnes, one of the senior agents, a tall man in his early 40s named David, stepped forward and extended his hand. We've been briefed. It's good to have you both here. We've got a lot of ground to cover. Emma shook his hand firmly. We're ready. Let's get this over with. David nodded, his expression grim. We've been tracking these shipments, the ones Rick was orchestrating. We've connected them to several criminal families in the Midwest and West Coast. They're all part of a larger syndicate, much more organized than we initially thought. They've been laundering money through various businesses, including some high-profile ones. It's not just drug trafficking. We're talking arms deals, human trafficking, and even ties to terrorist organizations. Megan's eyes narrowed. How did we not see this before? Rick was just the tip of the iceberg. David gave a short nod. Rick was a decoy, a local muscle. The real leaders have been hiding in plain sight, pulling strings from the shadows. We're still piecing it all together, but it's clear that this syndicate has been operating for years. Emma felt a sense of unease settle in her chest. The magnitude of what they were dealing with was overwhelming. They weren't just trying to bring down a small-time gang. They were up against an organized empire. The task ahead was monumental. "We've got our work cut out for us," Emma said, glancing at Megan, who looked as determined as ever. "But we're ready. What's the first step?" David pulled up a map on the large screen at the front of the room. It was dotted with red pins, marking locations where the syndicate had been active. "We've narrowed down the operation to a few key players. The first step is to take down their supply lines. We've identified several shipping routes that they've been using. We're going to need you and Megan to infiltrate one of their operations and gather intel." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Infiltrate? You're asking us to go undercover?" David nodded. "We have to hit them where it hurts. The best way to do that is to get inside, gain their trust, and expose their network from within. We've got a few trusted agents working undercover already, but we need more boots on the ground. That's where you two come in." Megan crossed her arms and leaned against the wall. "What's the plan?" "We'll be setting up a sting operation. We have a few key contacts in the criminal world who can help facilitate your entry. It'll be dangerous, but it's the best shot we have." Emma felt her pulse quicken. She'd been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a random operation. It was a coordinated, high-stakes battle against an organization that had infiltrated every aspect of society. And this time, the consequences were personal. "We'll do whatever it takes," Emma said, her voice resolute. "Just tell us where to start." David's eyes flicked to the screen, where a red pin marked a warehouse just outside of Denver. "This is our starting point. It's a front for one of the syndicate's money laundering operations. We believe they're shipping a large shipment of firearms next week. If we can intercept that shipment, it'll be a huge blow to their operation." Emma and Megan exchanged a glance. It was risky, but it was exactly the kind of mission they needed to stop the syndicate in its tracks. "We're in," Megan said without hesitation. David looked at both of them carefully. "I know you two are capable, but I need to remind you, this will get ugly. If you're in, there's no turning back." Emma took a deep breath. "We're already in. Let's bring them down." The night was unusually quiet as Emma and Megan made their way toward the warehouse on the outskirts of Denver. The streets were deserted, save for the occasional car passing by. The only sound was the hum of the city in the distance. Emma checked her gear one more time, making sure everything was in place. Her handgun, her communication device, and the small earpiece that would keep her in contact with the FBI team back at base. They were on their own tonight. "Ready?" Megan asked, her voice low but steady. "As ready as we'll ever be," Emma replied. The warehouse loomed ahead of them, a dark, nondescript building with no sign of activity, at least on the surface. But Emma knew that wasn't the case. They had been watching it for days, and they knew that the shipment was scheduled to arrive tonight. As they approached the entrance, Emma's heart beat in her throat. Every instinct told her that something was off, but she couldn't place it. There was a nagging feeling at the back of her mind that wouldn't go away. This was a trap, and they were walking right into it. But it was too late to turn back now. They slipped inside the shadows, carefully making their way toward the loading dock. The faint sounds of footsteps and low voices echoed through the building, sending a shiver down Emma's spine. They were close. Then, without warning, the doors to the loading dock opened, and a convoy of black trucks rumbled in. Emma's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The warehouse loomed in front of them, its metal doors standing like silent sentinels in the cold night air. Emma and Megan crouched behind a stack of pallets, hidden from view, watching the convoy of black trucks roll in. The low rumble of the engines vibrated through the concrete floor beneath their feet. Emma's pulse quickened as she checked her earpiece, adjusting it to ensure a clear connection with the FBI team monitoring from the command center. Her hand gripped her gun tightly, fingers itching to act. Every fiber of her being was on high alert. The feeling of something going wrong, something off, gnawed at her again, but she pushed it aside. There was no time for doubts. "This is it," Megan whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stay sharp." "Copy that," Emma responded, her voice tight with tension. The trucks pulled up to the loading dock, their engines cutting off one by one as the doors creaked open. Men in dark clothing began unloading the crates, moving with the practiced precision of a well-oiled machine. Emma's eyes narrowed as she observed their movements. There were more people here than she expected, and the crates they were unloading were much larger than she had anticipated. FBI, we're in position, Emma muttered into her comms. Ready to move on your mark. There was a brief pause before the voice of Agent David came through. Hold tight. We've got your back. Don't engage unless necessary. Understood, Emma said, her hand resting on the trigger. She could feel the weight of the moment, the potential for everything to go wrong. Megan shifted beside her, scanning the surroundings. Something's not right. Too many guys. Emma nodded, feeling a cold knot form in her stomach. She wasn't sure why, but the unease that had been haunting her all day was back, stronger than ever. Suddenly, a voice rang out in the warehouse, cutting through the tension like a knife. We've got company, a man barked, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps growing louder. Emma's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't part of the plan. They were supposed to have the warehouse surrounded. Where were the backup teams? Before she could react, the warehouse doors slammed shut with a deafening clang, locking them inside. The trap had been set. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. They weren't just here to intercept the shipment. They were the targets. Shit, Emma muttered, moving quickly to take cover behind a metal pillar. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she assessed the situation. Megan was already next to her, her eyes scanning for an exit. Get ready, Megan said, her voice low. We're not going down without a fight. Just as Emma was about to respond, the doors at the far end of the warehouse opened, and more men poured inside, blocking any hope of escape. They were surrounded. All right, ladies, a deep voice echoed through the cavernous space. We know who you are, and we know why you're here. Emma's blood ran cold as she slowly turned to face the man who had spoken. He was tall, with a dark beard and cold, calculating eyes. He was flanked by two other men, each armed and looking ready for a fight. Rick wasn't the only one we were watching, the man said with a smirk. Did you really think you could take us down that easily? Emma's eyes flashed with fury. You've underestimated us. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed. I don't think I have. The real question is, how far are you willing to go to stop this? Emma's mind raced. She knew they couldn't fight their way out of this. They had to find a way to turn the tables fast. The FBI team was out of range, and if they made a move now, it would be suicide. Megan leaned in, her voice barely audible. We need to create a distraction. I can take the one on the left. You get the guy in the middle? Emma nodded. On my mark. The tension in the room was palpable, each breath drawing them closer to the moment of action. Emma's hand slid to her gun, her grip tightening. She could feel the sweat on her palms, but she refused to let it show. This was their only shot. The man with the deep voice, who seemed to be in charge, took a step forward, his gaze narrowing at them both. You should have stayed out of this, Agent Barnes. You've gotten in way over your head. Before Emma could reply, Megan moved, her body a blur as she lunged at the man on the left. He was caught off guard, struggling to react as Megan tackled him to the ground, knocking his gun out of his hand in one swift motion. Emma didn't hesitate. The moment Megan engaged, she sprang into action, taking down the man in the middle with a perfectly aimed shot to his leg. He fell with a grunt, scrambling for his weapon, but Emma was faster, kicking the gun out of his reach. Go, go, Megan shouted, rolling to her feet as she grabbed the weapon of the man she had incapacitated. Emma didn't need to be told twice. They needed to move fast. The remaining man, the one who had been speaking, pulled out a gun, aiming directly at Emma. She didn't hesitate. Ducking behind a stack of crates, she shot at the lights above them, plunging the warehouse into darkness. Move, Emma barked. In the chaos, they could hear the sound of frantic footsteps, the shuffling of men trying to regain control. Megan was already on the move, using the confusion to flank the leader. Emma stayed low, keeping her gun trained on the shadows as she worked her way toward the back exit. The warehouse was a labyrinth of dark corners and scattered equipment, but Emma's training kicked in. She knew exactly how to use her environment to her advantage. Suddenly, A voice crackled in her earpiece. "Agent Barnes, this is David. We've got eyes on you. Backup's inbound. Hold tight." Emma's breath steadied, though she still felt the adrenaline surging through her veins. "Roger that. Just make sure they get here before this place turns into a war zone." The sound of gunfire erupted from the far end of the warehouse, and Emma knew that the fight was just beginning. They had thrown the first punch, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The warehouse was plunged into complete darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of emergency exit signs above and the sporadic flashes of gunfire. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted toward the far side of the building, her footsteps echoing on the cold concrete floor. The sounds of shouting and chaos filled the air, but she kept her focus. Her mind raced. There was no turning back now. They had triggered the fight, but it was far from over. The men in the warehouse were better armed, better prepared, and they outnumbered them. But Emma and Megan had one thing on their side: surprise. And that was enough to give them the upper hand for the moment. As Emma rounded a corner, she could hear Megan's voice in her earpiece, low and urgent. "I've got one of them cornered near the back exit. There are more coming in from the south side, though. We need to move fast." "Got it. I'm coming your way," Emma replied, scanning the darkened warehouse for any movement. She could hear footsteps echoing in the distance, but there was no sign of the leader, the man who had been calling the shots, the one who had taunted them before everything went sideways. In the shadows, she spotted a figure moving, and her instincts kicked in. Without hesitation, she raised her gun and fired a warning shot. The figure froze, raising his hands in surrender. "Who are you?" Emma demanded, stepping closer. The man looked up at her, sweat dripping from his forehead. I'm just a driver. I wasn't supposed to be involved. Please, don't shoot." Emma lowered her weapon slightly, her training kicking in. This wasn't her target, but he might have information. She needed to move fast. "Where's the leader?" she demanded. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously. "I don't know where he is. They said it was a trap, that you two were already onto them. They've been watching you for weeks." Emma's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a random ambush. It was a setup, and someone inside the FBI was working with them. They knew exactly who she and Megan were, where they were, and what they were planning. The realization sent a wave of ice through her veins. Betrayal. She stepped closer to the man, her voice low and dangerous. "Who else is here? Talk, and maybe I'll let you walk out of here." "I swear, I'm just a driver." He was cut off by a loud crash as a door slammed open on the far side of the warehouse. Figures spilled into the room, their weapons raised and their faces hidden by masks. Emma's pulse quickened. The leader wasn't the only one with backup. This was going from bad to worse and fast. "Move," Emma shouted into her comms. "Megan, get to the exit now." She didn't wait for a reply before bolting toward the nearest staircase, hoping to gain the high ground. Her mind was reeling. They had to escape. There was no way they could take on this many armed men without backup. As she reached the top of the stairs, she glanced over her shoulder to check on Megan. She saw her partner take down another man, knocking him unconscious before moving toward the back exit. "Almost there," Megan said through the earpiece, but there was a note of urgency in her voice. "There's more coming in. We've got to move." "Don't let them corner you," Emma ordered, her own hand tight on her gun. She glanced down, realizing that the man she had just interrogated had slipped away in the chaos. Damn it! The sirens outside suddenly wailed, growing louder. Backup had arrived. Emma's heart leapt as she heard the sound of the helicopter's blades overhead. The FBI was here, and they weren't alone. As she ran to the nearest exit, the night air hit her like a wall, the smell of damp asphalt and burning rubber filling her lungs. "Megan, where are you?" Emma shouted, looking frantically through the shadows. "I'm coming," Megan's voice came through, clear and steady. Emma turned just in time to see her partner sprinting toward her, her face grim but focused. They weren't safe yet. The convoy of black trucks was still parked near the loading docks, and the men inside them weren't backing down. The FBI agents would need a few more minutes to secure the area, and Emma knew that in this line of work, a few minutes could mean life or death. "Stay low. Follow me," Emma ordered. motioning for Megan to stick close. Together, they made their way toward the tree line, keeping low and using the cover of the shadows. As they neared the trees, the first shots rang out, shattering the stillness of the night. The men in the warehouse weren't giving up easily. Emma's instincts kicked in, and she dropped to the ground, her body pressed low to the earth. Megan was right behind her, her breath coming in quick gasps. "They're coming after us," Megan hissed. "We can't outrun them." "We don't have to outrun them," Emma said, her voice cool and steady. "We just need to make them think we're not here." The two women slipped into the underbrush, their bodies barely visible beneath the thick cover of trees. Emma's mind raced. She had no doubt that the leader was still alive, still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The ambush wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. Minutes later, the distant hum of the helicopters grew louder. Backup had finally reached the area. FBI agents were moving in from all sides, clearing the warehouse, taking out the remaining members of the syndicate, and securing the perimeter. But Emma and Megan were still in the woods, and they needed to get out before anyone realized they weren't with the rest of the team. "Megan, let's move," Emma whispered, signaling her partner to follow. The two women sprinted toward the tree line, the sound of their footsteps drowned out by the commotion behind them. They didn't look back as the first of the FBI agents began pouring into the clearing. Emma could only pray that the backup was enough to take down the rest of the syndicate. They had done their part. But now, the real fight was just beginning. The forest was eerily quiet as Emma and Megan slowed their pace, listening for any signs of pursuit. The distant sounds of helicopters and the occasional crackle of comm signals were the only indications that they were not alone. They had made it out of the immediate danger, but Emma knew this was far from over. The ambush had been just the beginning of something much larger. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces still missing from the puzzle. Who was behind the syndicate? And how far did the betrayal run? "Megan," Emma said, her voice low but urgent. "We need answers. Fast." This wasn't a random ambush. They knew exactly where we'd be. Megan nodded, her face hard with determination. "I know, but we can't move forward unless we've got the full picture. If we go in blind, we're dead." Emma took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her next words. "We need to get to the safe house. The team will be there. We can regroup, check in with David, and figure out what comes next." They continued their trek through the dense woods, moving silently under the cover of darkness. It felt like hours before they finally reached the edge of the forest, where a black SUV was parked, waiting for them. The FBI team had made sure they had a quick exit route, but the relief of seeing the vehicle did little to ease Emma's anxiety. As soon as they climbed into the SUV, Emma's thoughts turned to what awaited them back at the safe house. She didn't want to think about the possibility of a mole inside their operation, but every instinct screamed at her to trust no one, not even the people she had worked with for years. "David's going to want a full debrief," Megan said, as she buckled in. "He'll want answers. But what if we don't have them?" "We'll give him what we know," Emma replied, her jaw tight, "and we'll work the rest out. We don't have a choice." The SUV sped down the road, weaving through the darkened streets, the soft hum of the engine the only sound between them. As the miles ticked by, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The ambush hadn't been a random attack. It was too coordinated, too precise. And the fact that they had known exactly where to find them? It was clear that someone on the inside was feeding them information. The question was, who? When they arrived at the safe house, the mood was tense. The team was already there, gathered in the dimly lit living room, waiting for their report. Agent David, the team leader, stood by the window, his arms crossed as he glanced at them. "What happened?" David asked, his voice calm but sharp, cutting through the silence. Emma and Megan exchanged a look before Emma stepped forward. "It was a trap. We were set up." David didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed. "Who knew your location?" "That's what we need to figure out," Emma replied. "Whoever it was had all the intel. When we were coming, where we were meeting, everything." David nodded, his expression hardening. "I'll get the tech team on it. We'll trace the comms, see if we can find any leaks. But we can't waste time. The syndicate's operation isn't over. We know they're trying to move something big. We saw the crates, Megan added, taking a seat at the table. They were too large to be just weapons. Whatever's in there, it's more than just contraband. Emma crossed her arms, her mind racing. We need to find out what they're shipping, and we need to find out who's pulling the strings. David took a long breath before speaking. All right, we'll put pressure on the syndicate's known contacts, and we'll start looking at our own people, see if anyone's been compromised. Emma's heart skipped a beat at his last words. Anyone's been compromised. The thought of a mole within their ranks sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't imagine who it could be, but someone had to be feeding information to the enemy. Megan, let's check out the intel we got on the crates, Emma said, her voice sharp. If we're lucky, we'll find a clue that leads us to their operation. It's the only way we're going to figure out who's behind all this. Megan nodded, and the two of them headed to the back room, where the files were spread out across a large table. Emma flipped through them quickly, her fingers grazing over the notes from their previous surveillance. It was a blur of names, dates, and locations, nothing that immediately stood out. But then, one particular name caught her eye, Norton Shipping Company. Wait a second, Emma muttered, her finger hovering over the name. She glanced at Megan. This name keeps coming up. I've seen it before. Megan leaned in, her brow furrowing as she scanned the documents. Norton? That's the same company that's been linked to the illegal weapons trade, right? Exactly. Emma's mind began to race. Norton Shipping Company was a front that had been tied to several underground criminal operations. They moved everything from weapons to illegal goods, often in large, unmarked shipments. But something about it felt off. The fact that it kept popping up in their investigation was no coincidence. Something about this doesn't sit right, Emma said, tapping the file. We need to investigate Norton further. Megan glanced at the clock. Time's running out. If we don't get ahead of them, we risk losing everything. Emma's face hardened with determination. We won't lose. Not this time. The small, nondescript office building stood in the heart of a dilapidated industrial district, tucked away behind rusted gates and forgotten warehouses. Emma and Megan approached the front door, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. The quiet was unnerving, but it was exactly what they needed. The last thing they needed was attention. They traced Norton Shipping Company back to this address. It was a legitimate company on the surface, with a warehouse in the area and a handful of employees that seemed like ordinary people. But what they'd uncovered during their investigation pointed to something much darker. The company was a front for a vast network of illegal activities, smuggling, money laundering, and weapons trafficking. But the most chilling part? Norton Shipping Company had ties to the very syndicate they were hunting. And, if Emma was right, whoever was pulling the strings within that company could lead them straight to the mastermind behind the ambush. This is it, Emma whispered, adjusting her jacket as she glanced around one more time. We get in, find what we need, and get out. No mistakes. Megan nodded, her expression unreadable. We don't have time for mistakes. They made their way to the side door, the faintest sound of their boots hitting the concrete masked by the whirring of nearby machinery. Emma pulled out a small electronic device and silently began working on the lock. With a soft click, the door swung open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. Let's go, she murmured. They moved through the building with practiced ease, keeping their steps light and their senses sharp. The air smelled stale, with the faint scent of grease and dust hanging in the air. Emma's mind raced. They were about to infiltrate the heart of an operation that could bring down not just the syndicate, but a network of criminal enterprises stretching across multiple continents. The weight of their mission pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she couldn't let it distract her. Megan was a few steps behind, scanning the surroundings as they moved deeper into the facility. The place felt abandoned, empty, even, but Emma had learned to trust her instincts. Nothing about this felt right. They reached the first security checkpoint. Two guards stood just beyond the door, their backs to the hallway. Megan crouched low, signaling Emma to wait. She silently moved closer to the door, pausing just out of sight. Then, in one fluid motion, she slipped inside, her silenced pistol aimed at the guards. The shot rang out, and both men dropped to the floor without a sound. Emma followed, stepping over their bodies and signaling for Megan to keep moving. "This way," Emma whispered, leading the way down the narrow hallway. They had to get to the central office. If there was any information to be found, it would be there. They reached a steel door marked "Private" in bold letters. Emma tapped in the override code they'd stolen earlier from a contact in the FBI's tech division. The lock clicked, and the door opened with a soft hiss. The room beyond was lined with monitors, a dozen or more computers displaying files, maps, and encrypted communications. "I'll check the files. You cover the exits," Emma said, moving quickly to the nearest workstation. Megan nodded and moved toward the door, her hand on her gun, eyes darting between the hallway and the room. Emma worked quickly, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she pulled up data on Norton's Shipping Company's most recent shipments. She scanned through the numbers, dates, and locations, but everything seemed too clean, too easy. Then, she found it. A large shipment scheduled for the next day. The destination was listed as a port on the East Coast, but there was something odd about the destination code. It wasn't just a simple transfer, it was a direct link to a private island off the coast of South America. The coordinates were buried deep in the shipping manifest, and it looked like it had been hidden in plain sight. "This is it," Emma said, her heart pounding. "This is where they're taking whatever they're smuggling. The island, it's the key." Megan was already at her side, peering at the screen. "This could be the break we need. If we can intercept that shipment, we'll have them." Emma's mind raced as she thought through their next move. They couldn't risk letting this slip away. They needed to act fast, but they also needed backup. The island wasn't going to be easy to infiltrate, and they didn't have the resources to take on a well-guarded facility by themselves. "We'll need to report this to David, but we can't let them know we're onto them just yet. If we blow this now, it could be over before it starts." Megan nodded in agreement. "We should head back to the safe house, get the intel to him, and plan our next steps." But just as Emma was about to stand, the lights in the building suddenly flickered. A soft hum from the security system echoed through the walls, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. Someone had triggered an alarm. "Damn it," Emma muttered, standing up and quickly stuffing the files into her bag. "We've been compromised. Let's go." The two women rushed toward the exit, but just as they reached the door, a voice called out from the hallway. "Not so fast, ladies." Emma froze. The voice was familiar, a voice she had hoped she wouldn't hear again. She turned slowly to see the figure of the man from the ambush standing in the doorway, his face smirking. "You didn't really think you could just waltz in here and leave, did you?" Emma's heart raced, but her expression remained calm. This was the man behind the syndicate, the one who had orchestrated everything, the one who knew their every move. And now, they were trapped. The sound of Emma's heart pounding in her ears was almost deafening as she faced the man in the doorway. His smug expression made her blood run cold, as did the gun he casually held in one hand. It wasn't just the danger they were in that unsettled her. It was the feeling of being played. This man had been in control the entire time. Well, the man said, stepping into the room. "I'm impressed. You made it further than I expected. But this is where your luck runs out." Emma kept her cool, her eyes scanning the room for an escape. Megan stood beside her, her hand resting on her gun but not pulling the trigger just yet. They both knew that acting impulsively could lead to disaster. They needed to think their way out of this, and fast. "You don't have to do this," Emma said, her voice steady but laced with tension. "You've already made your move. What's the point in killing us now? We're not going to stop digging." The man chuckled darkly, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "Oh, you really think you're in control, don't you? You've been running around, chasing shadows, but you've missed the real game. The one where I'm always one step ahead. Who are you?" Megan demanded, her voice sharp, her finger twitching on the trigger. "You've been feeding us false leads, manipulating us from the start." The man's eyes flashed with something like amusement. "I didn't feed you false leads. I just let you think you were getting somewhere. You should have figured it out by now, but you're too blind to see. This whole operation? It's all been orchestrated by someone far more powerful than you can imagine." Emma's mind raced. This wasn't just about smuggling, weapons, or illegal deals. It was about power. The syndicate wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was part of something much bigger. Someone was pulling strings behind the scenes, someone with resources, influence, and reach far beyond anything they had prepared for. "You're telling me you've been working for someone else?" Emma asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Who the hell are you working for? Who's behind all this?" The man smiled, his eyes cold and calculating. "You're not ready for that answer, but you will be. Soon enough. All I can tell you is that the people I work for, they own everything. This whole operation, it's just a small piece of the puzzle." Emma's mind reeled. If there was a larger force at play, one that controlled everything from government officials to corporate giants, they were in way over their heads. She exchanged a quick glance with Megan, silently communicating the urgency of the situation. "Why don't you just kill us and get it over with?" Megan asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've had us cornered for a while now." The man's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, the sound of his boots echoing in the silence of the room. "Because killing you won't solve anything. No, I need you alive for now. You see, the island shipment? It's just the beginning. What's on that island is worth far more than your lives, and the people who want it, well, they'll stop at nothing to get it." "Who's behind the island?" Emma pressed, her voice tight. "What's on that island?" The man's smile twisted into something almost like pity. "You're not ready for that either, but I'll give you a hint. It's not just about money. It's about control and power. It's something that will change everything." With that, he turned toward the door, signaling to someone outside. "Take them to the holding room," he ordered. "We'll keep them alive for now, but I have more important matters to attend to." Emma's heart sank. They were running out of time, and now they were trapped. There was no way they could escape without some kind of help, and no one knew where they were. As the guards grabbed them, Emma struggled to keep her composure. She needed to think, to find a way out. But she knew one thing for sure. The answers she was seeking were on that island. And despite the odds, she couldn't let them slip away. The guards dragged them down a long hallway, their footsteps echoing as Emma and Megan exchanged worried glances. The place was eerily quiet now, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. The man, whoever he was, had just revealed that they were up against something far larger than they had anticipated. It was no longer just about the syndicate. It was about something much more dangerous. They were locked in a small, dimly lit holding room. Emma and Megan were left to sit in silence for a moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. Emma felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. They had been played. The pieces were in place, but they didn't have the full picture yet. "Are you okay?" Megan asked quietly. Emma didn't answer at first, her eyes scanning the room for any means of escape. She could feel her pulse quicken as she formulated a plan. She had to stay calm. They both had to. "We can't give up," Emma said finally, her voice resolute. "We're not out of this yet. We've come too far to stop now." Megan nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "Then what's the plan?" Emma stood up slowly, her mind working. She was looking for any weakness, anything that could help them escape. The door was solid, but the guards outside weren't invincible. They had trained for moments like this, and Emma knew it wasn't over. They had one shot left. "We need to get to that island," Emma said, turning toward Megan. "That's where the answers are. If we can find a way to get out of here, we'll find a way to stop whoever's behind all this." "All right," Megan said, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Let's make sure they don't see us coming." The holding room was cold, its concrete walls bare except for the flickering fluorescent light above. The low hum of the building's security system was the only sound in the otherwise silent room. Emma and Megan sat across from each other, their minds racing with possibilities. The island, the key to unraveling everything, was within reach, but their current situation was dire. Emma kept her eyes on the door. It was their only way out, but the guards outside would be waiting, and they knew their every move. It was clear now that they were dealing with something far beyond a simple criminal syndicate. Whoever was behind it all was as meticulous as they were ruthless. Megan broke the silence first, her voice low. "So, how do we get out of this one?" Emma stood up, pacing the small space. "We're going to need to make a move before they move us again. If we wait too long, they'll transfer us somewhere else, somewhere we won't get out of." Megan glanced at the metal door, then back at Emma. We've got one shot at this, and it's not going to be easy. What's the plan? Emma paused, running through the possibilities in her mind. They had limited resources, but there was one thing they had going for them: their training. They were both veterans, battle-hardened and resourceful. The fact that they had been caught didn't mean they were out of the game yet. First, we need to break out of this room. Then, we get to the control center. There's no way they're going to keep us locked up without monitoring every move we make. Once we disrupt their system, it'll be chaos, and we can slip through the cracks. Megan nodded, her expression hardening with determination. Got it. How do we break out of this room? Emma moved toward the corner of the room where an electrical panel was located. She'd noticed it earlier, and it might be their only chance. The building's power grid had to be somewhere near this room, and she was betting it could be manipulated with the right tools. Emma had learned a lot about electrical systems during her time in the military, and she wasn't about to let that skill go to waste now. I'm going to try to override the security system from here, Emma said, walking over to the panel. It'll take a few minutes, so you need to keep an eye out. If anyone comes down this hallway, we need to be ready. Megan pulled out her gun and checked the chamber, her eyes scanning every shadow in the corridor beyond the door. I'm ready. Emma knelt down and pried open the panel. Her hands worked quickly, connecting wires and bypassing circuits with practiced precision. It wasn't easy. This wasn't the kind of system that was meant to be tampered with, but Emma had dealt with worse. After a few tense moments, she connected the last wire, and the hum of the lights flickered. For a split second, Emma thought she'd failed. But then, with a soft beep, the entire room's security system shut down. That's our window, Emma said, standing up quickly. The door to the holding room clicked open, and the two women rushed into the hallway. The hallway was empty for now, but Emma knew that wouldn't last long. They had to move fast. Down the corridor, second door on the left, Emma said, leading the way. She was relying on her knowledge of the facility's layout, but they had no time to waste. The control room was just a few doors away, and if they could access the main terminals, they could scramble the cameras and security feeds long enough to escape. As they rounded the corner, they spotted two guards coming toward them, unaware of their presence. They had no choice but to act. Without a word, Megan dropped to the ground, aiming her gun at the guard's legs. A single shot rang out, and one of the guards went down, collapsing to the floor in a heap. The other guard barely had time to react before Emma lunged at him, knocking his weapon from his hand. With swift precision, Emma disarmed him, and a sharp punch to the jaw knocked him out cold. Good work, Megan said. Standing back up, Emma didn't answer, her focus already shifting to the door ahead. They couldn't waste any more time. They reached the control room in record time, and Emma kicked open the door. Inside, two techs sat at a bank of computers, oblivious to the intruders. Emma's gun was out in a flash, aimed at the techs. Don't move, Emma ordered, her voice calm but commanding. The techs froze, their eyes wide with fear. Megan moved swiftly, her hands already tying them up with zip ties. We need to access the central database, Emma said as she moved toward the computers, fingers flying across the keyboard. The techs had no choice but to comply, but Emma could see the fear in their eyes. They knew what would happen if they didn't cooperate. I need you to pull up the latest shipment logs, Emma continued, her tone sharp. All of them. Everything. Don't make me ask again. The techs complied, pulling up the requested files. Emma scanned the data quickly. There it was, the confirmation they needed. The shipment that was scheduled to leave for the island. The final pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place. I've got it, Emma muttered, grabbing a flash drive and plugging it into the computer. She copied all the files to the drive. This will get us to the island, but we need to move fast. Megan was already at the door, keeping watch. We've got company, she said, her voice tight. They're coming. We need to get out of here. Emma grabbed the drive and turned to the techs. You're not going to say anything, got it? The techs nodded frantically, terrified. Good, Emma said. Now we go. They rushed out of the control room, but as they made it halfway down the hall, they heard footsteps behind them. Emma's pulse quickened, but she didn't falter. They couldn't get caught now. We need to get to the back exit, Emma said. Now. Megan led the way, and they moved quickly through the maze of hallways, dodging security patrols and ducking into alcoves whenever they had to. They reached the back door just as a squad of guards rounded the corner. Emma's heart raced as she punched in the code to the exit. The door clicked open, and they ran into the night air. "We're not out of the woods yet," Megan said, glancing around nervously. "Let's get to the car and head to the rendezvous point." Emma nodded, but her mind was already on the next steps. The island, the shipment, everything was falling into place, and now it was time to act. They weren't just running anymore. They were about to take down the entire operation. The car was parked a few blocks away, and they reached it without incident. Emma slid into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. They had the intel they needed. Now they had to move fast. "Let's go," Emma said, slamming the car into gear. "We've got a long way to go." The night sky seemed to stretch on forever as Emma and Megan sped down the dark, empty road. The car's headlights cut through the thick darkness, illuminating the way forward. There was no turning back now. They had what they needed. Every bit of intel stored on a flash drive, and the only thing left to do was get to the island and expose the full extent of what was going on. Emma kept her focus on the road, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. Her mind was buzzing with questions. What was on the island? What exactly were they up against? She knew whatever was there had the power to change everything, but the unknown still loomed large in her mind. Megan broke the silence, her voice calm but laced with a certain tension. "We're almost there. How do you want to approach this?" Emma glanced at her, her eyes narrowing with determination. "We'll land, gather intel, and make contact with the people on the island. We have to keep a low profile. We don't know who's watching, and we can't afford to make any mistakes." "You sure we can trust the people on the island?" Megan asked, adjusting her seat and glancing out the window. "We don't have a choice," Emma said. "But if things go south, we'll have to make a quick exit." The car hummed quietly as they drove, passing through dense forest before emerging onto a small airstrip. The private plane was already waiting for them, its engine humming softly in the still night air. Emma parked the car, and they quickly unloaded the gear they'd need for the mission. As they approached the plane, the pilot, a burly man with a grizzled beard and weathered eyes, nodded at them. "Ready to go?" he asked, his deep voice gruff. Emma nodded, her gaze firm. "Let's get moving. The sooner we're there, the better." They boarded the plane and settled into their seats. The engine roared to life as the plane began its takeoff, cutting through the night air and heading straight for the island. Emma glanced at Megan once more. "We're going to find answers. We're going to end this," Emma said, the weight of her words hanging in the air between them. Megan didn't respond at first, but the look in her eyes said it all. She was just as determined as Emma to finish what they'd started. Together, they were unstoppable. As the island slowly came into view, the sense of urgency in the air thickened. The jungle stretched endlessly below them, with the distant sound of crashing waves breaking the silence. The plane descended slowly, and Emma could see the compound. A large, fortified facility nestled on the edge of the island, hidden away from prying eyes. It looked deceptively peaceful from the sky, but Emma knew better. This was no vacation spot. They landed without incident, and the plane taxied to a secluded hangar where a few armed men were waiting. The pilot nodded to Emma and Megan as they disembarked. "Good luck," he said, his voice betraying no hint of emotion as he quickly turned and took off in the plane, leaving them with nothing but the oppressive jungle and the looming compound ahead. Megan scanned the area, her eyes sharp. "Let's make this quick. No room for mistakes." Emma gave a quick nod, and they set off, weaving their way through the dense jungle toward the compound. It was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from their footsteps and the occasional call of distant birds. They moved as silently as possible, each step calculated and precise. After what felt like hours of navigating the thick jungle, they reached the outskirts of the compound. The high, chain-link fence surrounded the facility, topped with razor wire. There were guards patrolling the perimeter, their movements rigid and methodical. Emma signaled for Megan to wait, and she crouched low to observe the layout. "We'll need to get past them if we want to get inside," Emma said quietly. "But first, we need to figure out how to disable the security system." Megan raised an eyebrow. "I take it you have a plan?" Emma smiled slightly, her eyes gleaming with resolve. Always. She surveyed the area until she spotted a small maintenance shed near the perimeter wall. It wasn't much, but it could provide them with the tools they needed to hack into the security system. They just needed to get there without being spotted. Moving in synchronized silence, they approached the shed, staying low and hidden by the shadows. The guards continued their patrols, unaware of the two women slipping past them. Emma reached the shed first, quietly slipping inside and grabbing a crowbar. "This should do the trick," she muttered under her breath. With the crowbar in hand, she pried open the panel covering a series of electrical wires and circuits. "Once we cut the power, we'll have a few minutes to move before the backup kicks in," Emma explained, her mind working quickly as she worked on bypassing the system. Megan stood watch, her hand on her gun, scanning for any movement. The tension was palpable as Emma's fingers worked faster, bypassing wires and rerouting the electrical flow. Finally, with a soft click, the lights across the compound flickered and went dark. The sound of the security system powering down was the only confirmation they needed. "Let's move," Emma said, her voice tight with anticipation. They quickly advanced toward the compound's entrance, where a large steel door awaited them. Emma's heart raced as they approached. This was the moment. They had to find out what was really happening here. With one last look at Megan, Emma used the crowbar to pry open the door, and they slipped inside. The darkness in the compound seemed to close in around Emma and Megan as they moved through the hallways, the only light coming from the glow of emergency backup lights that flickered intermittently. The sound of their footsteps was muffled against the cold concrete floor, but every breath they took seemed amplified in the eerie silence. They were inside, and the clock was ticking. Emma signaled for Megan to follow her as they moved deeper into the compound, their bodies pressed close to the walls to stay out of sight. The security blackout wouldn't last long, and they had no intention of being caught. "We need to find the central control room," Emma whispered, her voice low but steady. "That's where they're keeping the most critical information. Once we have access, we'll learn everything." Megan nodded, her eyes scanning their surroundings, alert for any sign of danger. "And then? And then we get the hell out of here with whatever intel we can carry," Emma replied, her voice unwavering despite the rising tension. "We need to expose what they've been hiding, whatever it is. This island isn't just a front. There's something bigger at play here." They rounded a corner and encountered a large set of double doors. Emma paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked for any sign of a security checkpoint or guards. The area seemed unusually quiet, but Emma had learned long ago to never underestimate the silence in places like this. She reached for the handle and pulled the door open just enough to slip inside. The room beyond was large, filled with rows of monitors, computers, and high-tech equipment. This had to be the control room. "Keep your head down," Emma muttered to Megan, motioning for her to stay out of view of the cameras. The room was staffed by several technicians, their eyes glued to the monitors, unaware of the intrusion. Emma moved like a shadow, her steps silent as she approached the main console, her fingers dancing across the keyboard to override the security locks. The room buzzed with activity around them, but their presence went unnoticed, for now. "Are we in?" Megan asked quietly, watching the technicians warily. Emma didn't answer immediately. She was too focused on the task. She bypassed a few firewalls, then accessed a terminal that displayed the data they needed. A slew of confidential files appeared on the screen, each labeled with codes and references that meant nothing to the average person. But Emma knew better. "This is it," Emma breathed, her fingers quickly scrolling through the data. "We've got records of shipments, names, and codes, everything. But there's one file that stands out." She clicked on the file labeled Project Blackstone, and her heart skipped a beat. The contents of the file were cryptic, but the key points were clear. Blackstone wasn't just a name. It was a highly secretive operation that involved multiple government agencies and private contractors. Megan stepped closer, peering over Emma's shoulder. "What is this? What does it mean?" Emma's fingers hovered over the screen as she read the details. It was a series of weaponized biological experiments, involving human testing and advanced warfare technology. The island wasn't just a research facility. It was a site for covert military projects that had been hidden from the world. They're using the island as a front to develop bioweapons, Emma said, her voice low but laced with disbelief. And it's all tied into Project Blackstone. This isn't just illegal, it's a threat to global security. Megan's jaw clenched. And we're the ones who have to stop it. Before Emma could respond, the door to the control room creaked open, and 2 guards stepped inside, speaking quietly among themselves. Emma's heart raced as she quickly closed the file and shoved the flash drive into her pocket. "Stay low," Emma whispered, pulling Megan behind a stack of crates. They crouched silently, holding their breath as the guards walked past, oblivious to their presence. Once the guards had passed and the room fell silent again, Emma stood up. "We've got what we need. Let's move." They slipped out of the control room and made their way down a narrow corridor that led to another door at the end. Emma was already scanning the facility's layout in her mind. There was only one way out now, through the emergency exit on the far side of the compound. As they navigated the labyrinthine hallways, they encountered more guards. It wasn't unexpected. With the security systems down, it was clear they'd be more vulnerable to patrols looking for intruders. But Emma and Megan had been in tight situations before, and they were prepared. They took down the first 2 guards silently, using their training to neutralize them without making a sound. They moved quickly, stepping over the bodies as they pressed on. As they neared the exit, Emma noticed something that made her stop dead in her tracks. There, ahead of them, was a large metal door with a red, flashing warning light. It was locked, and several armed guards stood on either side, scanning the area. Emma's mind raced. This was it, the final hurdle before they could escape the island. They had to get through, but there was no time to waste. "On 3, we take them out," Emma whispered. "Stay low. Don't get spotted." Megan nodded, her grip tightening around her weapon. "Got it." The countdown began in Emma's mind. 1, 2, 3. They moved in unison, emerging from their hiding spots just as the guards turned their heads. Emma took out the first guard with a swift shot to the chest, while Megan dropped to her knees, taking out the second guard with a precise shot to the head. Without a word, they bolted for the door, Emma already working on the security panel. A quick swipe with a stolen keycard from one of the guards, and the door clicked open. They rushed outside, into the open air, with the sounds of their footsteps and the pounding of their hearts the only things they could hear. "We're not done yet," Emma said, her voice hard. "We've got to get off this island." Megan glanced behind them, checking for any signs of pursuit. How? Emma's mind was already working through their options. The plane, their only way out, was still waiting on the far side of the island. But they weren't the only ones trying to escape. "We move fast," Emma said. "We don't stop until we're out of sight." As they sprinted through the jungle, the compound behind them began to glow with the flashing lights of alarm sirens. The countdown was on. The authorities would soon be on their trail, but Emma was determined. This mission wasn't just about escape. It was about exposing the truth. And with the data they had, the game had just changed. The jungle stretched out before them, thick and oppressive. The sounds of alarm sirens echoed in the distance, a sharp reminder that time was running out. Emma's heart raced as she and Megan pushed through the underbrush, the ground beneath their boots soft and treacherous. Their mission had shifted from infiltration to sheer survival, and the stakes had never been higher. "They're going to know we're here soon," Megan said, her voice tight with urgency as she glanced over her shoulder. "We need to keep moving." Emma nodded, her mind calculating their options with every step. The compound was behind them now, but the island wasn't vast. They couldn't afford to be caught in the open, and the path to the plane was far from clear. "We're heading toward the ridge," Emma said, pointing to the distant mountain that rose above the jungle. "There's a small landing strip on the other side. If we can make it there, we'll be in the clear." Megan glanced at her, skepticism flickering in her eyes. "You sure about that? The guards will be looking for us in the forest. We don't have a lot of cover." "We don't have a choice," Emma replied, her voice resolute. "It's our best shot." They moved quickly, weaving through the trees, trying to stay hidden. The sounds of the compound's alarms faded, replaced by the ominous rustling of the jungle. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every noise seemed amplified in the quiet. Every rustle of leaves felt like a footstep behind them. The adrenaline was sharp, and Emma's senses were on high alert. Her mind was still processing everything they had uncovered. Project Blackstone, the bioweapons, the sinister operations. But for now, there was no room for distraction. They needed to get out. As they neared the edge of the jungle, Emma's eyes caught sight of a narrow trail leading up the side of the ridge. She motioned for Megan to follow her and started up the incline. The path was steep, but it would lead them closer to the ridge where the plane was waiting. "Keep your head down," Emma said, her voice low as they made their way up the trail. "The higher we go, the more exposed we'll be." The jungle seemed to thicken around them, the trees pressing in on either side as they ascended. The higher they climbed, the more they could hear the distant sound of engines, guards or reinforcements, closing in on their location. Emma's instincts kicked into overdrive, and she picked up the pace, her muscles burning as she forced herself to move faster. Halfway up the ridge, they stopped to catch their breath, hidden behind a thick grove of trees. Emma peered through the foliage, scanning the area below them. The compound was visible from here, a maze of buildings and fences that looked almost peaceful from a distance. But Emma knew better. The facility was a powder keg, and they had just lit the fuse. "We need to move now," Emma said, her voice urgent. "The backup security system will be online any minute, and when it is, the whole island will be locked down. We'll never get to the plane." Megan nodded, her jaw set in determination. "Let's go." They continued upward, faster now, pushing themselves as hard as they could. Emma's thoughts were a blur. Every minute they spent climbing felt like an eternity, every second bringing them closer to being discovered. But they had no choice. The plane was their only hope. The ridge loomed closer, the landing strip just over the crest. They were so close, but the final stretch was a deadly one. The path had narrowed, and now there were no trees to provide cover. They were exposed, and the open ridge stretched out before them like a runway, leaving no place to hide. Emma's eyes darted back down toward the jungle. "Stay low. Don't let them see us." They crouched low and moved as silently as possible, their hearts pounding as they reached the top of the ridge. The landing strip was ahead, a small, isolated airfield with a single, private plane sitting quietly at one end. The pilot was there, standing next to the plane and looking in their direction, but he didn't seem alarmed. Emma exhaled in relief. "That's our ride," Megan whispered, the first flicker of hope breaking through the tension in her voice. Emma scanned the horizon again, her eyes narrowing. They weren't out of the woods yet. The plane was still a few hundred yards away, and they could hear the sound of footsteps behind them now. Guards, getting closer. "We don't have time to waste," Emma muttered. She pulled Megan into a sprint, her legs burning as she pushed forward. The sound of their footsteps was drowned out by the roar of a distant engine, but Emma knew it was only a matter of time before they were spotted. They were almost there, just a few more steps. Emma's lungs burned as she surged ahead, feeling the thudding of her heart in her chest. They were so close. And then, suddenly, there was a crack, a sharp, loud sound that split the air. A bullet whizzed past Emma's head, missing her by inches. She swerved to the side, pulling Megan with her as they hit the ground. "Get down," Emma shouted, pulling Megan into the cover of a nearby boulder. The sound of gunfire erupted around them, echoing off the ridge as guards emerged from the trees below, weapons drawn. "Damn it," Megan cursed under her breath, her hand already on her own gun. "They're right behind us." Emma's heart was racing, but her mind was focused. She knew they couldn't outrun them, not without backup. The plane was still waiting, but the guards were closing in fast. She glanced at Megan, who was already preparing to return fire. "We have to get to that plane now." With a swift motion, Emma pulled out her handgun and fired a warning shot. The guards hesitated, momentarily distracted. It was enough. Emma grabbed Megan by the arm, pulling her up. "Let's go," she shouted. They broke into a sprint again, running full speed toward the plane. The gunfire resumed, but Emma kept her focus on the plane ahead. It was 100 yards away, then 50, then 20. The plane's engines roared to life, and the pilot was already revving the throttle, preparing for takeoff. "Almost there," Megan panted, her breath ragged. Emma reached out just as they reached the plane, grabbing the ladder and hauling herself up. Megan was right behind her, climbing into the plane as the wheels started to lift off the ground. The island fell away below them, and Emma exhaled, her body trembling with relief. They were finally free. But even as they soared into the sky, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. They had the data they needed, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Too many powerful people who would stop at nothing to keep the truth hidden. And Emma was just getting started. The plane soared through the sky, its engines humming steadily as Emma and Megan finally allowed themselves a moment of respite. The island was a shrinking speck behind them, but the weight of the mission, and what they had uncovered, still hung heavy on their shoulders. The tension in the air was palpable, as though the battle was far from over, even though they were physically out of immediate danger. Emma leaned back in her seat, eyes closed, trying to process everything that had happened. The files they had stolen from the compound were burned into her memory. Project Blackstone, the covert military operation, the biological warfare, and the deadly truth that no one was supposed to know. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about one corrupt organization or government agency. It was about the global balance of power, about hidden threats that could affect millions of lives. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Megan's voice broke through Emma's thoughts, pulling her back to the present. Emma didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window, watching the clouds pass by. It was hard to imagine that, just hours ago, they had been in the heart of an island filled with danger, secrets, and corruption. Now, they were flying towards safety, but safety felt like an illusion. If they were going to expose what they had uncovered, they needed to figure out their next move. "We're not safe yet," Emma finally replied, her voice quiet but firm. "They'll come for us eventually, but we can't wait around for them to make the first move. We need to take the offensive. We have the data, Megan. We need to get it out there." Megan nodded, her gaze intense. "How? The world isn't just going to believe us. This goes way deeper than we imagined. Those files, Project Blackstone, it's too big for anyone to take seriously." Emma's hand gripped the edge of her seat as she thought. The files were heavy with damning evidence, but they needed more than just proof. They needed allies. Powerful people who could help them bring the truth to light. But who could they trust? "We'll go to the press," Emma said after a long pause. "We get the data to the right journalists, people who can handle it and get it out there. But we have to be careful. If we just walk into the wrong office with this kind of information, we'll be branded as terrorists or conspiracy theorists." Megan glanced at Emma, her expression hardening. "And what if they've got eyes everywhere? What if someone on the outside is in on it? Someone who can stop us before we even make it to a safe house?" "We don't have a choice," Emma replied. "We'll go underground, move in the shadows, and make sure the information gets out no matter what. But we need to stay a step ahead of them. We need to hit them where it hurts. Financially, politically." The sound of the plane's engines roared in Emma's ears as she sank into her thoughts. The mission had taken a toll on both of them. The adrenaline of the past few days had kept them moving, kept them alive. But now the reality of their situation was starting to settle in. Their lives were no longer their own. They were hunted, and the powerful forces behind Project Blackstone were relentless. "We'll figure it out," Emma said, turning to Megan. "But first, we need to get off the grid. Lay low. Then, we'll strike when the time's right." Megan's eyes narrowed, her expression steely with resolve. "I'm with you. You've been leading this mission from the start, and I trust you. But we're going to need a plan. A good one." Emma nodded, appreciating Megan's loyalty and understanding. She had trusted her every step of the way. But now, as they flew further from the island, the real work began. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. There were too many lives at stake. A few hours later, the plane landed in a small, private airstrip just outside of a remote town. Emma's mind raced as she quickly grabbed their things and helped Megan out of the plane. They didn't have much time to waste. Their faces were likely on every security camera on the island, and their names were already being circulated in the system. They needed to get to ground zero, where they could contact the right people and start the process of exposing everything. Emma handed Megan a burner phone. "Call the journalist I mentioned. Get them to meet us. We've got to move quickly." Megan's fingers were already dialing the number as they walked toward the waiting car. "Got it." Let's hope this works. As the car sped down the narrow roads, Emma stared out of the window, her mind replaying the sequence of events. The escape from the compound, the discovery of the files, and the final push to get away. The island was behind them, but Emma knew they couldn't rest yet. The moment they let their guard down, they would be in danger again. The next few days were a blur of movement. Emma and Megan went underground, using a network of safe houses and encrypted communication to stay off the radar. They kept moving, constantly on the move, changing locations as often as they could. The world they once knew seemed distant now. Everything had changed. They couldn't trust anyone, not even their former allies. The journalist Emma had contacted proved to be the right call. A few days later, they met in a secluded cafe, far from prying eyes. After a tense conversation and careful handover of the data, the journalist assured them that they would get the story out. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The journalist was nervous, almost too nervous. "Don't trust anyone," Emma had warned them. "If this gets out, we'll be targets. Make sure the information is protected." The journalist had nodded, their eyes flickering with doubt. "I'll do what I can. But once the world knows, there's no going back." Emma didn't need to hear any more. The truth was out there now. It was only a matter of time before Project Blackstone was exposed to the world. As they left the cafe and moved toward their next safe house, Emma felt a mix of relief and apprehension. They had made it this far, but the hardest part was yet to come. The fight for the truth had only just begun. The weeks following their escape were a whirlwind of uncertainty and fear. Emma and Megan had gone deep underground, moving constantly, switching locations, and using every trick in their arsenal to stay off the grid. The world had yet to learn the full extent of what they had uncovered, but the news was beginning to spread. Whispers of Project Blackstone were filtering through the media, but it was still a faraway rumor. A conspiracy theory for some, too unbelievable for others. But Emma knew better. The storm was coming, and it was only a matter of time before the people responsible for Blackstone made their move. Emma sat in the dimly lit room of their latest safe house, her eyes glued to the laptop screen. The journalists they had worked with had kept their promise, getting the first wave of information out to trusted sources. The files were now circulating through the underground media channels, but the true war had just begun. The government, private corporations, and powerful figures who had been complicit in Project Blackstone wouldn't let it go easily. Emma could feel their eyes on her, even now. Megan walked into the room, her posture stiff, her eyes hard. She had the look of a soldier on edge, constantly aware of the dangers surrounding them. "They've moved faster than we expected," Megan said, her voice laced with frustration. "People are already starting to cover their tracks. Some of the names in the files are disappearing. Black sites, private planes, encrypted comms. They're trying to clean up the mess." Emma nodded, the weight of what they had unleashed pressing heavily on her shoulders. "We knew this wouldn't be easy. They'll stop at nothing to protect themselves. But we're not backing down. The world deserves to know the truth." Megan paced the room, her hand running through her hair. "And what if we can't stop them in time? What if they get to the journalists, to everyone we've trusted?" Emma locked eyes with her. "Then we fight harder. We get the story out to the right people, and we make sure they can't silence us." There was a pause, a heavy silence that hung between them. Megan knew Emma wasn't just talking about exposing the truth anymore. This was about survival. They had become the hunted, and there was no going back. Late that night, as Emma and Megan prepared for their next move, their worst fears were realized. A quiet knock on the door interrupted the otherwise still night. Emma's heart skipped a beat. They were never supposed to have visitors. Not here, not now. Megan's hand instinctively reached for the gun tucked in her waistband, but Emma stopped her with a quick gesture. She had to be sure. Slowly, Emma approached the door, her senses alert, scanning for any sign of a trap. She peered through the peephole and saw a shadowy figure standing outside, familiar yet uncertain. She opened the door cautiously, her voice low. "Who's there?" The figure stepped into the light, revealing an older man with sharp, intelligent eyes. His face was weathered, but there was a calmness to him that seemed out of place in their dangerous world. "Emma Clark?" he asked, his voice steady. "I have information you need." Emma tensed, her instinct screaming that this was no coincidence. What kind of information? The man glanced over his shoulder before leaning in closer. The people behind Project Blackstone aren't just looking for you. They're looking for everything you've uncovered, and they won't stop until they've erased it. Emma's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? Who are you? My name is Jack Thompson, the man said. I used to work with Blackstone. I'm here to help you, but you need to move fast. Emma's mind was racing. She didn't know whether to trust this man or not, but something about the urgency in his voice made her hesitate. Why should I trust you? Emma asked, narrowing her eyes. Jack took a step back, his hands raised in surrender. Because I've seen the damage Blackstone can do, and I know who the real enemy is. They've already started targeting journalists. They have connections everywhere, intelligence, government, corporations. But I can give you the names of those behind it. If you want to take them down, you need to move quickly. Emma exchanged a glance with Megan. The stakes had just escalated. Let's go, Emma said, her voice firm. We'll take whatever you have. But know this, Jack. If this is a trap, you won't live to see the sunrise. Jack didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The next few hours were a blur of action. Jack led them to a secure location, an underground facility hidden beneath an unassuming building in a quiet part of the city. Inside, he handed Emma a hard drive, an encrypted drive that contained the names, locations, and connections of everyone involved in Project Blackstone. These people are powerful, Jack warned, but they're not untouchable. You just need the right leverage, the right timing. But you have to be ready. They'll come after you. Emma nodded. She had been ready for this fight since the moment they uncovered the truth. But the stakes had never been higher. We'll get this information out, she said, her voice cold with determination. And when we do, it won't just be about exposing Blackstone. It will be about bringing every person responsible to justice. As Emma and Megan left the underground facility, a cold sense of inevitability settled in. They were nearing the final battle, the moment where the truth would either set them free or seal their fate. The enemy was closing in. The information was out, but the race to stop Project Blackstone from disappearing into the shadows was more urgent than ever. Emma knew they couldn't wait any longer. They had to act. In the coming days, Emma and Megan would set their plan in motion. The world was about to learn the truth, and nothing would stop them from making sure it was heard. The final confrontation with the people behind Blackstone was inevitable, but Emma was prepared. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to back down now. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice.